Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is David Rodriguez, and this happened to me back in the summer of 2012. I was fresh out of college trying to figure out life like most of us do. With a newly minted English degree from SUNY Buffalo and a stack of student loan papers that seemed to grow taller by the day, I found myself in that peculiar limbo that so many recent graduates experience. The publishing houses in New York City weren't exactly beating down my door, and my part-time job at Barnes & Noble barely covered my share of a cramped apartment in Queens. When I stumbled across the job listing for Lakewood Summer Camp, it seemed like the perfect temporary escape. The pay wasn't great, $2,000 for the summer, but it came with room and board, and more importantly, it offered a chance to step away from the suffocating pressure of post-graduation expectations. Lakewood was exactly what you'd expect from an upstate New York summer camp, the kind of place that could have been pulled straight from a Norman Rockwell painting or a nostalgic coming-of-age film. Nestled in the Adirondacks, about 4 hours north of the city, the camp sprawled across 60 acres of pristine wilderness. The centerpiece was Lake Chapman, its waters so clear you could see straight to the bottom near the shore. A dozen rustic cabins dotted the shoreline, their cedar walls weathered to a silvery gray by decades of summer storms and winter snows. The main lodge, a massive structure built in the 1950s from local timber, served as both dining hall and recreation center, its stone fireplace reaching up toward exposed wooden beams that creaked and groaned with every thunderstorm. My co-counselor, Russ Overby, was something of an enigma. He might have been in his late 20s, though his weathered face and calloused hands made it hard to pin down his exact age. While most counselors were college students or recent graduates like myself, Russ was a camp lifer. He knew every trail, every hidden fishing spot, and could predict incoming weather changes just by watching the way the pine needles moved in the wind. Despite his extensive knowledge, he remained remarkably reserved about his personal life. The few details I managed to gather came in fragments. He'd served in the military, had worked at camps across the country, and seemed to prefer the company of trees to people. There was something in his eyes that suggested he'd seen things he preferred not to discuss, and none of us pressed him on it. The first few weeks of camp proceeded exactly as you'd expect. Our cabin housed 8 boys, ages 10 to 12, each bringing their own particular blend of energy and anxiety to the group. There was Marcus, the natural leader who organized midnight snack raids; Tyler, who could recite every Pokemon evolution chain but struggled to make eye contact; Diego, whose homesickness manifested in long letters he wrote to his mother every night; and 5 others, each finding their place in the peculiar social ecosystem that forms in every summer camp cabin. We filled our days with the usual activities: archery lessons in the morning, swimming in the afternoon, and campfire stories at night. The rhythm of camp life began to feel natural, almost predictable. But everything changed on that Friday night in mid-July. The air had been unusually still all day, the kind of heavy stillness that often precedes a storm. The kids had finally settled down after an evening of ghost stories and s'mores, their whispers fading into the steady breathing of sleep. Russ and I were sitting on the cabin's covered porch, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath our rocking chairs. We'd fallen into a comfortable routine of sharing the evening watch, talking about nothing in particular while keeping an ear out for any midnight wanderers or homesick cries. The scream that pierced the night was unlike anything I'd heard before. Not the playful shriek of children playing, nor the startled yelp of someone surprised. This was primal, guttural, and cut off so abruptly it left an almost physical absence in the air. When Russ volunteered to investigate, I didn't think much of it. He was the experienced one after all, and his military background made him better suited for handling potential emergencies. I watched his flashlight beam bounce through the trees as he headed toward the lake, the yellow light growing fainter until it disappeared entirely behind the thick foliage. The next 2 hours were among the longest of my life. I tried the radio repeatedly, but only static answered. My cell phone, usually able to catch at least 1 bar of signal from the hilltop behind the dining hall, showed nothing but a blank screen. The kids slept on, blissfully unaware of the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the lake, Russ still hadn't returned. The disappearance of Russ marked the beginning of a nightmare that would unfold over the next 3 weeks. The initial search party, organized by Camp Director Marcus Westbrook, consisted of every available staff member combing the woods in expanding circles from where Russ was last seen. We found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. The local police arrived by mid-morning, their initial skepticism about a missing person report slowly giving way to concern, as they realized none of us were being dramatic about the circumstances of his disappearance. They brought in dogs, which seemed unusually agitated, and refused to follow any trail. The state police joined the search by day 3, but even their more sophisticated resources turned up nothing. The camp administration tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Parents were notified of an ongoing situation, carefully worded emails assuring them that their children were safe and that all appropriate security measures were in place. But you can't hide tension from kids, not really. They picked up on the whispered conversations, the nervous glances, the way counselors now moved in pairs and carried walkie-talkies at all times. The disappearance of Lila Martinez a week later shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. Lila's disappearance hit differently than Russ's. She had been walking back from the dining hall after the staff meeting, a route so familiar we could all walk it blindfolded. The distance from the main lodge to her cabin was exactly 247 steps. I know because she'd once counted them out loud, joking about how she could navigate it during power outages. A former lifeguard from California working her way through grad school, Lila had been the kind of counselor who seemed to have endless reserves of energy and optimism. The night she vanished, she'd been leading the discussion about how to keep the kids' spirits up, despite the growing tension. Security footage from the dining hall's single outdoor camera showed her leaving at 9:42 p.m. The next frame, time-stamped just seconds later, showed an empty path. The police investigation intensified, but their increased presence only heightened the sense of unease. State troopers patrolled the grounds in pairs, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They interviewed everyone multiple times, their questions becoming increasingly pointed. Had anyone noticed changes in Russ's behavior before he disappeared? Did Lila have any enemies? Were there any disgruntled former employees? The implications hung in the air. Either someone at the camp was responsible, or something far more inexplicable was happening. It was around this time that the children began talking about the Shadow Man. At first it seemed like typical camp folklore, the kind of story that spreads through whispered conversations after lights out. But there was something different about these accounts, a consistency that sent chills down my spine. Each description was eerily similar, a tall, impossibly thin figure that seemed to absorb light rather than block it. The kids in Cabin 7 swore they saw it standing between trees during their nature hike. 2 girls from Cabin 3 refused to use the bathroom at night after seeing it outside their window. Even some of the older campers, usually quick to dismiss ghost stories, admitted to seeing something they couldn't explain. My own encounter with the figure came on a Tuesday night. The air conditioning in our cabin had been acting up, leaving the room stiflingly hot despite the cool mountain air outside. I'd propped open the windows and door, hoping to create a cross breeze. Around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch, not the random creaks of settling wood, but deliberate, measured steps. The baseball bat I'd started keeping beside my bed felt absurdly inadequate as I approached the door. The full moon cast enough light to see clearly, which somehow made the sight before me even more terrifying. The figure stood at the edge of the tree line, exactly where the mowed grass gave way to wild undergrowth. It was as the kids had described, unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions all wrong for a human being. But what struck me most was its stillness. Even in the slight breeze that stirred the trees, it remained perfectly motionless, like a tear in the fabric of reality. The rational part of my brain searched for explanations, a trick of light, a shadow cast by swaying branches, my own fear-addled imagination. But then it moved, not a step or a gesture, but a sort of ripple, as if its form was only loosely bound together. I called out, my voice sounding pathetically small in the vast darkness. The figure remained silent. but I felt its attention shift toward me with an almost physical weight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave the kids. I backed into the cabin, secured the door, and spent the rest of the night checking and rechecking that every window was locked. The discovery of Tommy's disappearance the next day seemed almost inevitable. We were on the Summit Trail, a moderate hike that offered views of the entire camp property. Tommy had been at the back of the group where I was supposed to be watching him. I looked down to check the trail map for our next waypoint, and when I looked up again, he was gone. Just gone. No scuffed dirt to indicate a fall, no crashed branches suggesting he'd wandered off trail. 30 seconds at most of distraction had cost me an 11-year-old boy. The camp erupted into chaos. Parents arrived in a steady stream of SUVs and minivans, many not even bothering to pack their children's belongings before whisking them away. Mr. Westbrook held an emergency staff meeting where he announced the early closure of the camp season, his usual commanding presence diminished by dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands. The police established a command center in the dining hall, their radios crackling with updates from search teams that never found anything. It was during the frantic packing and evacuation that I found the note, tucked between the pages of the cabin's logbook. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, pressing so hard into the paper that some letters had torn through. "Help me. The Shadow Man is real." I recognized Tommy's handwriting from the postcards he'd written home, but this was different, desperate, afraid. The police added it to their evidence bags with professionally masked skepticism. The discovery of Russ's cabin happened on what was supposed to be our last night at camp. Most families had already left, leaving behind a ghost town of half-empty cabins and abandoned arts and crafts projects. I couldn't sleep, plagued by the feeling that I was missing something crucial. The lake had always been Russ's favorite spot for thinking, so I headed there, perhaps hoping to find some clarity of my own. The hidden structure was easy to miss, tucked behind a stand of hemlocks that had grown around it like a living curtain. The cabin itself was older than any other building at camp, its construction predating even the main lodge. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, opening with a groan that seemed to echo across the water. The interior of the cabin felt wrong in a way I struggled to define. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating decades of decay. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that made my throat tighten. My flashlight beam revealed walls covered in photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. They spanned different eras, black and white images from what looked like the 1950s mixed with color photos from more recent decades. All showed groups of campers and counselors, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. What stopped me cold was a photo that couldn't have been more than a few years old. In it, Russ stood with another group of counselors in front of a different camp. The name Pine Grove Summer Camp was visible on a banner behind them. According to the date scrawled on the back, it was taken in 2010. That camp had been shut down after 3 disappearances. The journal sat on a crude wooden table in the center of the room, its leather cover cracked and weathered. It wasn't just Russ's journal, I realized, as I began to read. The earliest entries dated back to 1958, each writer picking up where the last had left off. They told the same story, the appearance of an impossible figure, followed by disappearances. Sometimes years would pass between incidents, but the pattern remained consistent. Russ's entries began 3 years ago, documenting his investigation of similar occurrences at other camps across the country. He had been tracking this thing, following its trail from camp to camp, trying to understand what it was and how to stop it. His final entry was dated the night he disappeared. I thought I could outsmart it, study it long enough to find a weakness, but it knows I'm watching. It's been toying with us all along. The Native Americans who first lived here called it the hunger that walks. The oldest stories say it feeds not on flesh, but on fear and innocence. Summer camps are perfect hunting grounds, isolated, full of children with just enough darkness in the woods to make everyone doubt what they see. If you're reading this, don't try to fight it. Just, The entry ended mid-word, a long ink streak suggesting he'd been interrupted while writing. As I processed what I'd read, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and writhe. I turned around slowly, already knowing what I would see. The shadow man filled the doorway, its form somehow both solid and insubstantial. This close, I could see that what I had taken for a face was more like an absence, a void in the shape of features. It moved with a fluidity that defied physics, crossing the space between us faster than I could react. The flashlight beam passed through it like smoke, but there was nothing insubstantial about its presence. The cold emanating from it was physical, burning my skin and clouding my thoughts with primitive terror. What happened next was pure instinct. I swung the flashlight like a club, knowing it would pass through but needing to do something, anything. The shadow man recoiled, not from the flashlight itself, but from the beam of light that cut through its form. In that moment of clarity, I remembered something from the early pages of the journal. It is strongest in darkness, weakest in the light of dawn. I had one chance. I ran, not toward the camp but toward the lake. The shadow man pursued, its movements making a sound like wind through dead leaves. I could feel its cold grasp, barely missing my neck, my back, my shoulders. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the first hint of dawn breaking over the mountains. I needed to make it to the boathouse. There was a backup generator there, and with it, the high-powered lights we used for evening swimming events. My lungs were burning as I reached the boathouse door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the key into the lock. I could hear the thing right behind me, feel its unnatural cold seeping into my bones. The door finally opened and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut and fumbling for the generator switch. Nothing happened. I tried again, panic rising in my throat as shadows began seeping under the door. On the third try, the generator roared to life, and with it, 4 1,000-watt halogen lights blazed into brilliance. The shadow man's screech was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not sound so much as the absence of sound, a void that tried to pull my sanity with it. In the harsh artificial light, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its form was deteriorating, pieces of shadow flaking away like burning paper. As the first real rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, it fragmented entirely, dissolving into nothing more than ordinary darkness that vanished in the dawn. The police found me in the boathouse an hour later, still holding the flashlight in white-knuckled hands. They also found the hidden cabin, though the photographs and journal had vanished, leaving behind only decade-old dust. The official investigation concluded with a frustrating lack of answers. Theories ranged from bear attacks to serial killers to elaborate hoaxes, but nothing explained the lack of evidence, the impossibility of the disappearances. Lakewood Camp was sold at auction the following year. The buildings were demolished to make way for luxury vacation homes. Sometimes I drive up there, watching construction crews tear down the woods where children once played, wondering if they're doing us a favor. The disappearances stopped, at least at Lakewood, but I keep tabs on summer camps across the country, looking for patterns in missing persons reports. Every now and then I see something familiar: 3 disappearances at a camp in Oregon, a counselor gone missing in Maine, children telling stories about a tall figure in the woods. I've never gone camping again. These days I teach high school English in Queens, about as far from the wilderness as I can get. But sometimes, on cold nights when the shadows in my apartment seem a little too deep, I remember what Russ wrote about the thing's hunting grounds. Summer camps are perfect, isolated, full of children, with just enough darkness in the woods to make everyone doubt what they see. And I wonder if making everyone doubt what they saw wasn't part of its strategy all along. The grief hits you in waves, they say, but for me it was more like an undertow constant, pulling, threatening to drag me under with every breath. I lost Sarah in June of 2000, not to the vast ocean of possibilities we'd planned for our future, but to the toxic cocktail of chemicals that was supposed to be her salvation. The chemo ravaged her body while I watched, helpless, as she slipped away in that sterile hospital room that became our world for 3 months. I remember the way the fluorescent lights cast everyone in that sickly green pallor, making it impossible to tell the dying from the living. I'm Emmett Yoder, 15 years a park ranger. most of them spent in Yellowstone's organized chaos. But after Sarah, I couldn't bear the sight of another minivan full of tourists armed with their cameras and their forced cheer. Couldn't stomach another day of answering the same questions about Old Faithful's schedule. Every excited family reminded me of the future we'd lost. Every child's laugh echoed with the hollow sound of the ones we'd never have. So when the position opened up in Glacier National Park's backcountry, I grabbed it like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. The transfer wasn't just a job change, it was an escape. Glacier was different from Yellowstone in every way that mattered. Where Yellowstone was a carefully managed wilderness theme park, Glacier was raw, untamed. The peaks didn't just reach for the sky, they clawed at it, jagged teeth of rock and ice that seemed to dare you to venture closer. The grizzlies weren't attractions to be photographed from the safety of your car. They were apex predators that commanded respect and distance. My duties were straightforward enough. Patrol the backcountry trails, monitor wildlife activity, and keep the more adventurous visitors from becoming statistics. Simple work that left plenty of room for the silence I craved. Those first weeks were a blessing. The solitude wrapped around me like a familiar blanket, the kind of quiet that lets a man's thoughts settle like sediment in still water. My days fell into a comfortable rhythm, early mornings watching the sun paint the glaciers pink, long hours walking trails that seemed to lead to the edge of the world. The occasional incidents were manageable, freeing a moose calf from abandoned fishing line, turning back unprepared hikers before they could become rescue statistics, documenting wildlife movements. I started sleeping through the night again, something I hadn't done since Sarah's diagnosis. But nature has a way of reminding you that you're just a visitor in her domain, and by mid-July, things began to shift. It started with the carcasses, elk and deer mainly, but occasionally smaller mammals too. As a ranger, I was no stranger to predator kills, but these were different. The wounds didn't match any pattern I recognized, and the way the bodies were positioned seemed almost deliberate. The tracks nearby were what really set my teeth on edge. They were almost human, but elongated, with impressions that suggested claws where toes should be. I documented everything, took photos, made plaster casts of the prints, but kept my theories to myself. 15 years of experience told me these weren't bear kills, but I wasn't ready to voice what my gut was suggesting. That evening in late July changed everything. I was heading back to my cabin after a long day of trail maintenance, the kind of work that keeps your hands busy while your mind wanders. The sun was setting behind Mount Jackson, turning the sky into a painter's palette of oranges and purples. The shadows were getting long, stretching across the trail like grasping fingers when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the familiar growl of a grizzly or the scream of a mountain lion. It was something else entirely, something that made the primitive part of my brain start screaming danger. My hand moved to my radio first, then to the .44 Magnum on my hip standard issue for backcountry rangers, though I'd only ever used it for putting down injured animals. The sound came again, closer this time, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I've been in the wilderness long enough to know when I'm being hunted, and every instinct I had was telling me to run. But training kicked in, and I held my ground, scanning the tree line for movement. That's when I saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the trail about 30 yards ahead, perfectly still in a way that nothing natural stands. The setting sun was at its back, turning it into a silhouette that my mind struggled to process. It was tall, far taller than any man I'd ever seen, with proportions that were just wrong enough to send chills down my spine. Its arms hung almost to the ground, ending in hands that seemed too large for even its massive frame. The head was what stopped my breath entirely, elongated and misshapen, with a pronounced snout that reminded me of a wolf's muzzle, but wrong, all wrong. I'd like to say I maintained my professional composure, that 15 years of ranger training kicked in and I handled the situation by the book. But there is no protocol for what I was facing. My voice cracked as I shouted the standard challenge, "Identify yourself." The words seemed absurd even as they left my mouth. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to produce a park permit or apologize for being off trail. The creature's response was to tilt its head in an almost curious gesture. Those eyes, God, those eyes, reflecting the dying sunlight like mirrors. Then it moved. Everything I know about large predators told me it should have been impossible for something that size to move that fast. One moment it was 30 yards away, the next it was covering the distance between us with a speed that defied physics. I fired. The .44 roared in my hands, the recoil familiar and almost comforting in its normalcy. I saw the impact, saw dark fluid spray from its chest, but it kept coming. I fired again and again, the reports echoing off the mountain walls, until the hammer fell on an empty chamber. The creature lay sprawled on the trail, its massive frame twitching in the dust. The smell hit me then, not the copper tang of blood, but something chemical, almost industrial. What happened next has haunted me far more than the encounter itself. I approached the body carefully, sidearm reloaded, following every protocol I'd ever learned about approaching downed wildlife. The skin was wrong cold and slick like a fish left too long in the sun. But it was the eyes that still wake me up at night. Even in death, they held an intelligence that was undeniably predatory, undeniably aware. I reached for my radio to call it in, turned to get my bearings for coordinates, and when I looked back, it was gone. No blood trail, no drag marks, nothing to suggest that something that size had ever been there at all. I spent hours searching the area with my flashlight, documenting everything I could. But it was like trying to photograph a nightmare. The harder I looked, the less evidence I found. The official report reads like a bad fiction story. Unknown predator, possible bear, ranger discharged weapon in self-defense. They did a cursory investigation, of course. Found my shell casings, noted the broken vegetation where the creature had fallen. But without a body, without concrete evidence, the incident was filed away as another unexplained backcountry occurrence. I might have convinced myself it was stress, grief, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. That's what the park psychologist suggested when I finally told the whole story. Trauma, she said, manifests in unexpected ways. But then came the night at my cabin, and the evidence that couldn't be ignored. I was sitting by the fireplace trying to lose myself in an old Jack London novel when I heard the scratching. Not the familiar sound of branches against the roof or small animals under the porch, but deliberate, methodical scraping at my door. I knew before I looked. The same creature or another like it stood on my porch, its massive frame blocking out the security light like an eclipse. This time I didn't challenge it. This time I ran. The official report states that Tyler Matthews, age 19, from Minneapolis, was killed by a grizzly bear 2 days later. The photos of his campsite tell a different story, one of calculated violence rather than animal predation. They found pieces of him scattered across half an acre, but the pattern was all wrong for a bear. Bears don't arrange body parts in geometric patterns. Bears don't leave messages written in blood on tent walls. I left Glacier a week later. Couldn't take another day of writing reports that lied about what I knew was out there. Now I'm back in Ohio, surrounded by the comfortable mundanity of civilization. My new job involves checking fishing licenses and making sure people don't litter in state parks. But I know what's out there in the deep wilderness, in the places where the maps still show blank spaces. Sometimes on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that growl again, calling me back to the mountains. Sarah used to say that everyone has their own monsters to face. She meant it metaphorically, talking about my grief over her diagnosis, her fear of the treatment that eventually killed her. But now I know better. There are real monsters in this world wearing shapes that don't quite fit, moving in ways that deny natural law. They're out there in the dark spaces, watching, waiting, and sometimes when I see news reports of missing hikers or unexplained animal attacks in national parks, I wonder if anyone else has seen what I saw, if they live to tell about it. The Park Service still sends me requests to return to Glacier. They're short-staffed, they say, and my experience would be valuable. But they don't understand that my experience is exactly why I can't go back. Some things once seen can't be unseen. Some knowledge changes you forever. So I stay here in the flatlands, where the tallest things are radio towers and water tanks, where the shadows are just shadows and the noises in the night can all be explained. But I know it's still out there, waiting in the high places where the air is thin and the stars seem close enough to touch. And sometimes in my dreams I'm back on that trail, watching the sun set behind Mount Jackson, waiting for those eyes to find me again in the gathering dark. My name is Evan Thunderbird, and what I'm about to share happened to me on September 19th, 1994. I've spent years debating whether to tell this story, but with recent events in Belford, I feel compelled to finally put it down on paper. I was 24 back then, fresh out of college with a business degree that seemed about as useful as a screen door on a submarine in our little corner of Oregon. Belford wasn't just small, it was the kind of town where the weekly newspaper's front page might feature Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning tomatoes, or the high school marching band's new uniforms. The population sign at the town limits read 2,847, though I swear they hadn't updated it since the Carter administration. I was living back home with my parents in their modest two-story house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd grown up counting ceiling tiles during summer thunderstorms. My bedroom still had the same faded Metallica posters on the walls and the crack in the window frame from when I'd tried to sneak out to a party in junior year. My father, Jim Thunderbird, ran Thunder Auto and Repair, the only garage in town that could handle everything from a simple oil change to rebuilding a transmission from scratch. He'd inherited it from his father, and everyone assumed I'd do the same someday. The shop sat on the corner of Main and Pine, its weather-beaten sign creaking in the wind, the concrete floor permanently stained with decades of oil and grease. My best friend, Rhett, was in the same boat. His family owned the largest dairy farm on the outskirts of town, 300 acres of rolling pastures that had been in the Kinney family since Oregon was still a territory. Rhett was the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when everything was going wrong. He had this infectious smile, and a habit of running his hands through his perpetually messy red hair whenever he was thinking hard about something. We'd been inseparable since third grade when he'd stuck up for me against Tommy Wilson and his gang of playground bullies. That September evening started like any other. I'd spent the day at the shop, my hands raw from wrestling with a stubborn timing belt on old Mr. Peterson's Buick. The sun was setting behind the Douglas firs that surrounded our town, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Rhett showed up around 7 in his beaten-up Levi's and flannel shirt, grease still under his fingernails from his own day's work at the farm. He'd brought a 6-pack of Rainier beer and a proposition to go night fishing at Lake Bellwood. Lake Bellwood wasn't much more than a glorified pond about 5 miles outside town, nestled deep in the forest where the paved roads gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Local legend said it was bottomless, though my dad swore he'd once touched the bottom while diving for a lost anchor. The lake had been our escape throughout high school, a place where we could forget about the pressures of being the sons of Belford's legacy families and just be ourselves. We loaded up my '85 Ford F-150, a graduation present from my dad that I'd spent countless hours restoring, with our fishing gear, 2 weathered, ugly stick rods, a tackle box full of lures we'd collected over the years, and an old Coleman lantern that had belonged to my grandfather. The truck's engine coughed to life with its familiar rattle, and we headed out of town on Highway 42, the only road that connected Belford to the outside world. The conversation on the drive was easy, comfortable, the way it can only be between friends who've known each other their whole lives. We talked about Rhett's younger sister Kayla starting her freshman year at Oregon State, about my dad hinting more strongly than ever that I should take over the shop, about the girls we'd dated in high school and where they'd ended up. But beneath the familiar banter, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. We were both avoiding the bigger questions that loomed over us. What we were doing with our lives, whether we'd ever break free from the gravitational pull of our small town. We parked at our usual spot, a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the lake's edge. The September air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn and the musty smell of decomposing leaves. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness as we made our way down the familiar trail, ducking under low-hanging branches and stepping over fallen logs. The forest was alive with night sounds, the hollow hoot of a great horned owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant cry of a coyote. We settled into our favorite fishing spot, a fallen Douglas fir that extended about 10 feet into the water, creating a natural pier. The lake was mirror smooth, reflecting the half moon and stars above. We cracked open our beers and cast our lines, the soft plop of the lures breaking the silence. Rhett started telling one of his signature stories about the time his dad's prize bull got loose and led them on a chase through Mrs. Wainwright's garden party. That's when we saw it. A flickering light across the lake, barely visible through the dense trees. At first we thought it might be other fishermen or maybe some teenagers having a bonfire, but something about it felt wrong. The light had an unnatural quality to it, not the warm orange of a campfire, but a cold, bluish glow that seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm. "Hey, Tuck," Rhett said, his voice suddenly serious, using my childhood nickname. "You ever notice a cabin over there before?" I hadn't, and I knew every inch of this lake. We'd spent countless summers swimming, fishing, and exploring these shores. A cabin wasn't something you just missed. Yet there it was, a dark silhouette barely visible in the gloom, with that strange light emanating from its windows. The decision to investigate the cabin wasn't made with words, just a shared look between Rhett and me, the kind that comes from 2 decades of friendship. We reeled in our lines and packed up our gear, leaving the beer cans in a neat pile to collect on our way back. The night had grown colder, and the mist rolling off the lake created ghostly shapes that seemed to reach for us as we walked. Getting to the other side of the lake meant navigating an old game trail that hadn't seen maintenance since before we were born. Our flashlight beams bounced off the low-hanging mist, creating an eerie tunnel effect through the darkness. Rhett walked point, just like he always did when we were kids playing soldiers in these same woods. Every few steps we'd hear the crack of a branch beneath our feet, or the sudden rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. Normal forest sounds, but somehow more sinister in the context of our mission. "Remember that summer we tried to convince everyone there was a Bigfoot out here?" Rhett whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. I managed a weak laugh, remembering how we'd made fake footprints using my dad's old work boots and some plaster of Paris. The memory should have been comforting, but instead, it highlighted how different this night felt from our childhood adventures. As we got closer to the cabin, the strange blue light we'd seen from across the lake seemed to fade, like a candle being slowly suffocated. The structure itself emerged from the darkness. A single-story log cabin that looked like it had been standing since Oregon gained statehood. The logs were dark with age and rot, the roof sagging dangerously in the middle. Dead leaves and pine needles formed a thick carpet around the foundation, suggesting no one had cleared the area in years. The windows were boarded up with weathered planks, except for one that had partially broken away, creating a jagged opening like a missing tooth. The front door hung askew on its hinges, and even from several yards away I could smell the musty odor of decay and abandonment wafting from the entrance. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, more to myself than to Rhett. "My grandfather used to take me hunting all through these woods. He knew every cabin, every shelter, every old homestead within 20 miles of Belford. He never mentioned this place." Rhett pulled out his Zippo, the one with the Marine Corps emblem his uncle had given him before shipping out to Vietnam, and flicked it to life. The small flame cast just enough light to reveal a crude symbol carved into the doorframe, 3 interconnected circles with what looked like writing inside them, though the letters were too worn to make out. "Maybe it's newer than we think," Rhett suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Everything about the cabin spoke of age, decades, if not centuries, of exposure to Oregon's harsh winters and damp summers. The decision to enter the cabin came with the same unspoken agreement as our decision to investigate. Looking back now, I wonder if we were under some kind of influence, like moths drawn to a flame. The door creaked open with surprising ease, as if it were welcoming us inside. The interior of the cabin was a single room about 20 feet square. Our flashlight beams revealed furniture that might have once been nice, but had long since succumbed to time and elements. A rotting wooden table, 3 chairs, one overturned, a pot-bellied stove with rust eating through its sides, and what might have been a bed frame, though only the metal skeleton remained. Papers were scattered everywhere, their edges curled with moisture, the text long since faded to illegibility. The air inside was thick with dust, and each breath felt like inhaling decades of decay. As we moved further in, our footsteps echoed strangely, suggesting there might be space beneath the floorboards. The walls were lined with shelves, most empty except for a few mason jars filled with unidentifiable substances that had turned black with age. That's when I found the photograph. It was partially hidden beneath a fallen shelf, preserved somehow despite the cabin's obvious exposure to the elements. The image showed 7 people standing in front of the cabin, but not this cabin. At least, not as it appeared now. In the photo, the cabin was well maintained, its logs gleaming with fresh varnish, flowers growing in window boxes. The family consisted of what appeared to be a mother, father, and 5 children of varying ages, all dressed in clothes that looked to be from the early 1970s. But something was wrong with the image. The faces of the children were blurred, not from damage to the photograph, but as if they had been moving when the picture was taken. Yet the rest of the image was crystal clear, including the parents' faces, which wore expressions I can only describe as vacant, their eyes seeming to stare through the camera rather than at it. I was about to show the photograph to Rhett when we heard it, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought it might be the wind finding its way through cracks in the walls. But it grew steadily louder, and there was an unmistakable pattern to it, like multiple voices speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. The words were almost recognizable, hovering just at the edge of comprehension, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. Rhett grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Tell me you hear that," he whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The whispers were changing, becoming more distinct, though still maddeningly unclear. It reminded me of trying to tune an old radio, catching fragments of voices between bursts of static. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the metal flashlight handle became painfully cold against my palm. The beam of my flashlight began to flicker, though I'd just put in fresh batteries before leaving home. Rhett's light was doing the same, casting unstable shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. "Maybe we should," Rhett started to suggest, but he was cut off by a sound from above us. It was like footsteps, but wrong somehow, too light, too quick, like children running across the ceiling. Except there couldn't be a ceiling above us. The cabin was a single story, and we could see the underside of the roof beams. I pulled the photograph from my pocket where I'd unconsciously stuffed it. In the unstable light, the image seemed to shift and change. The blurred faces of the children appeared to be looking directly at us now, though I knew that was impossible. The parents' expressions remained vacant, but their eyes were completely black. "Tucker," Rhett's voice was barely audible. "Look." In the far corner of the cabin, partially hidden by shadows, a trap door lay in the floor. It was made of the same weathered wood as the rest of the cabin, but the hinges looked newer, well-oiled. No dust had settled around its edges. The whispering grew louder, and now we could make out words: "Come down, come play, come stay." The voices were childlike but wrong, like an adult trying to imitate a child's voice and getting it almost but not quite right. They seemed to be coming from beneath the trap door. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but something kept us rooted in place. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something more sinister was at work. Looking back, I think whatever force resided in that cabin wanted us to find what was below. With trembling hands, I reached for the trapdoor's iron ring. The metal was ice cold, and as I pulled, it opened with disturbing ease, revealing a set of stairs descending into absolute darkness. A blast of cold air hit us, carrying with it the smell of earth and something else, something chemical and medicinal, like the formaldehyde we'd used in high school biology class. Our flashlights revealed wooden stairs leading down about 15 feet to a dirt floor. The basement was larger than the cabin above, extending out beyond the foundation. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of mason jars, similar to the ones upstairs, but these were clearly preserved, their contents floating in murky liquid that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. But it was the center of the room that held our attention. A perfect circle had been carved into the dirt floor, its edges lined with candles that looked fresh though unlit. Strange symbols were etched around the circle's perimeter, the same interconnected circles we'd seen on the doorframe above, but here they were complete, untouched by time. Rhett moved closer to examine one of the mason jars. "Tucker," he said, his voice cracking, "these aren't preserves." Before he could elaborate, our flashlights went out simultaneously, plunging us into perfect darkness. The temperature dropped so low it burned to breathe. The whispering surrounded us now, coming from all directions at once. Then in the darkness we saw them. 3 pairs of eyes hovering at about chest height, completely black and reflecting no light. They belonged to what appeared to be children, though something about their proportions was subtly wrong. They stood perfectly still, their forms barely visible in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come," one of them said in a voice that sounded like several children speaking in unison. "But now that you're here—" The figures began to move toward us with an unnatural grace, their feet not quite touching the ground. The whispering grew to a crescendo, and with it came understanding, horrible, unwanted understanding of what had happened in this basement. The Granger family hadn't just disappeared, they'd been transformed into something else, something that hungered for more families, more children. I fumbled for my dad's shotgun, more out of instinct than any real hope it would help. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the basement in stark detail. I saw things in that flash of light that my mind has spent years trying to forget. The true contents of those jars, the half-finished ritual circle, the true forms of the children advancing toward us. The blast seemed to disrupt whatever force held the entities together. They dispersed like smoke in a strong wind, their forms fragmenting and swirling away into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if they would reform. We ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, bursting out of the cabin into the cool night air. The forest was different as we ran. The trees seemed to lean inward, branches reaching for us like grasping fingers. Every root sought to trip us. Every shadow concealed potential horrors. We didn't stop running until we reached my truck, and even then we didn't pause to catch our breath. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of the clearing, gravel spraying behind us. Neither of us spoke during the drive back to town. What could we say? The impossible things we'd seen defied explanation. Every few seconds I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black eyes floating behind us. Rhett kept rubbing his arms, though the night wasn't particularly cold anymore. We ended up at Denny's, the only place in Belford open 24 hours, sitting in a corner booth under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything seem surreal in a different way. The teenage waitress, Jenny Martinez, gave us odd looks as she poured our coffee. Later, I'd learn why. We were covered in dirt and cobwebs, our clothes damp with basement moisture, and our faces were pale as death. "We have to tell someone," Rhett finally said, his hands shaking as he lifted his coffee cup. The normalcy of the restaurant, the clinking of dishes, the mumbled conversations of late-night truckers, the smell of burnt coffee, made what we'd experienced seem even more horrifying by contrast. "Who would believe us?" I asked, but I knew we had to try. The next morning we went to see Sheriff Marcus Darby. I'd known him my whole life. He'd coached my Little League team, given me my first speeding ticket, and helped my dad when our shop was vandalized back in '89. His office smelled of coffee and gun oil, with fishing trophies lining the walls and a stack of unsolved case files on his desk. He listened patiently as we told our story, his weathered face revealing nothing. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking in protest. "Boys," he said, running a hand through his graying hair, "I'm going to tell you something that doesn't leave this room." He pulled open his bottom desk drawer and took out a thick file, its edges yellow with age. The Grangers weren't the first to disappear around here. The file contained police reports dating back to the 1800s. Every few decades, families would vanish in the area around Lake Bellwood, sometimes just parents, sometimes entire households. The cases were never solved, but there were patterns, reports of strange lights, children's laughter in the woods, and black-eyed figures seen at windows. "My grandfather was sheriff here too," Darby continued. "He told me stories I didn't believe until I had this job. Some things in these woods are better left alone. My advice, forget what you saw. Move on with your lives." But forgetting proved impossible. The photograph I'd taken from the cabin became an obsession. I spent hours studying it, noting how the parents' expressions changed subtly each time I looked at it. Sometimes they seemed to be screaming silently, other times their black eyes appeared to follow me around the room. Rhett and I tried to return to our normal routines, but nothing felt normal anymore. I threw myself into work at the garage, taking on extra hours, anything to keep my mind occupied. Rhett started drinking more heavily, showing up at the shop at odd hours to share new theories about what we'd seen. One night, about 3 months after our encounter, Rhett called me at 2 a.m. He was drunk, his words slurring together, but his message was clear. He'd been researching similar cases across the country. He claimed to have found a pattern, something about ley lines and ancient Native American burial grounds. "They're not ghosts, Tucker," he said, his voice urgent. "There's something older, something that was here before us, something that wears children like masks." He promised to show me his research the next day, but Rhett never showed up. His truck was found parked at Lake Bellwood, his fishing gear neatly arranged on the shore. The surface of the lake was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Search parties combed the woods for weeks. Dogs lost his scent at the lake's edge. Divers found nothing in the water. I knew where he'd gone, of course, but I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe that my best friend had been taken by black-eyed children in an impossible cabin? His sister Kayla called me regularly for updates, her voice growing more desperate each time. The town buzzed with rumors: suicide, accident, foul play. Some suggested he'd simply left, unable to face the pressure of taking over the family farm. Only Mrs. Wainwright, the oldest resident in town, seemed to understand. I caught her watching me one day as I left the grocery store. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked, her rheumy eyes knowing. "The children, they're always hungry for more, always searching for new families to join their congregation." Years have passed since then. I left Belford shortly after Rhett's disappearance, unable to bear the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed me everywhere. I moved to Portland, took some community college courses in automotive management, and opened my own shop. On paper, I'm successful, married now, with 2 kids of my own. But I never go camping. I avoid lakes and forests, and every September 19th, I lock all the doors and windows, draw the curtains tight, and wait for dawn. Because sometimes on very quiet nights, I still hear those whispers, and sometimes when I check on my sleeping children, I catch a glimpse of something in their bedroom mirror. Floating black eyes, watching, waiting, inviting me to join their eternal playground beneath Lake Bellwood. I keep the photograph in a safe deposit box now. Every year, one more face in it becomes clear, and I swear the latest one looks just like Rhett, forever young, forever smiling, forever trapped in that moment of transformation. Sometimes I wonder if one day I'll open the box and see my own face staring back at me, eyes as black as midnight, caught in the same vacant expression that marked all the others who ventured too close to the hungry darkness that lurks in the woods of Belford, Oregon. My name is Lucas Skyhawk, and this happened to me back in 1995. I was living in a small town in northern Montana near the edge of the Blackfeet Reservation, one of those places where everybody knows everybody, and the closest Walmart was a 2-hour drive away. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up old trucks and cars for the locals in a weathered garage that had been standing since the 1960s. The work wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy and put food on the table. Most days were spent with my hands deep in engine blocks, the smell of motor oil and metal shavings becoming as familiar as morning coffee. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. The town had its own rhythm, slow, steady, and predictable, like the seasons that painted our landscape in ever-changing colors. Most evenings, after closing up shop, I'd go out for a hike in the nearby woods just to clear my head and enjoy the quiet. There was something therapeutic about leaving behind the clanking of tools and the whir of machinery for the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. The forest had become my sanctuary, a place where the day's worries seemed to dissolve into the crisp mountain air. One autumn evening, when the aspen leaves were turning gold and the air carried that first hint of winter's bite, I decided to take a different trail. I'd heard stories about it from some of the old-timers who would gather at Earl's Diner for their morning coffee. They spoke of a hidden lake tucked away in a valley that few people ever visited. Most of their tales were usually exaggerated fishing stories or tall tales about massive elk. but something about the way they described this lake caught my attention. They mentioned ancient pictographs on nearby rocks and spoke of the water being so clear you could see straight to the bottom, even at its deepest point. It sounded like a good adventure, so I packed a small bag with some water, a couple of energy bars, and a bag of trail mix. I grabbed my reliable Maglite flashlight, the heavy metal one that could double as a weapon if needed, and set out just as the afternoon was waning. The sun was setting as I started my hike, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape that made everything look like it had been dipped in honey. Long shadows stretched across the trail like reaching fingers, and the scattered clouds above were painted in brilliant shades of pink and purple. The path was narrow and overgrown, clearly less traveled than my usual routes. Thick patches of huckleberry bushes crowded the edges, their leaves rustling in the light breeze. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nature, something that made me feel more connected to the land than I ever did in town. About an hour into my hike, the sky had turned from twilight to full dark, and the woods were getting thicker. The trail was barely visible now, marked only by subtle breaks in the undergrowth and the occasional old blaze mark on a tree trunk. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a knife, creating strange shadows that seemed to dance and shift with each step. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was starting to create small clouds in the beam of light. That's when I heard it, a strange noise, like someone or something moving through the brush, but not with the familiar pattern of deer or elk. The sound was more deliberate, almost calculated. I stopped dead in my tracks, clicking off my flashlight to listen more carefully. The forest fell silent except for my own breathing, which suddenly seemed far too loud. Probably just an animal, I told myself, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Years of living near wilderness had taught me to recognize the sounds of most local wildlife. But this was different. There was something unnatural about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I continued walking, trying to ignore the feeling, but the noise came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing. My heart was pounding now as I swept my flashlight beam through the darkness. The light caught nothing but trees and underbrush, but somehow that made it worse. The tall pines around me seemed to have grown closer together, their branches interlacing overhead to block out what little moonlight managed to filter through the clouds. The air felt heavy and thick, like just before a thunderstorm, and the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the hooting of owls, the rustle of small animals, had gone completely silent. I decided to head back, thinking I'd return during daylight when I could better read the trail markers. Just as I turned around, I saw something move in my peripheral vision, something tall and humanoid slipping behind a tree with an unnatural grace that made my stomach lurch. "Hello!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear building in my chest. The word echoed through the trees and faded into nothing. No response, not even a bird call, just that oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the forest floor with what felt like thunderous volume. The beam of my flashlight bounced erratically as I walked, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few steps, my neck muscles tight with tension. The woods seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pounding like a drum. I wasn't a superstitious man. Years of working with machines had made me practical, logical. But this was different. This was unsettling in a way that defied rational explanation. The stories of the old spirits and creatures of the land started playing in my mind, stories my grandfather used to tell me when I was a kid. He was half Blackfeet, and he spoke of ancient beings that still wandered these forests, entities that were neither human nor animal, but something else entirely. At the time, I dismissed them as just stories meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Now, with every step I took, those tales seemed less like fiction and more like warnings. As I walked, the noises followed, always just out of sight. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps matching my own, other times like something large moving through the underbrush parallel to my path. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker then stronger in irregular pulses. I cursed under my breath. Great, just what I needed. I stopped to smack it a couple of times against my palm, a mechanic's universal fix-all solution. That's when I looked up and saw it. Standing about 20 feet away was a figure that turned my blood to ice. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed too thin to support its frame. The skin that covered its gaunt form was a pale, sickly color that seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam rather than reflect it. But it was the eyes that truly paralyzed me. They glowed with an internal light, like twin embers in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly predatory. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, trying to categorize it as something familiar, a bear standing on its hind legs, perhaps, or even a very tall person playing a cruel joke. But I knew, on some primal level, that this was something else entirely. It moved slowly, deliberately toward me, each step accompanied by the sound of cracking twigs and rustling leaves. Its movements were fluid but wrong somehow, like watching a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, and for once I listened without question. I bolted, running as fast as I could down the trail, my boots pounding against the earth in a frantic rhythm. The forest became a blur as I ran. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging scratches across my cheeks and forehead. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely managing to keep my balance as I fled. The creature pursued me with an unnatural speed, its footfalls behind me sounding more like something with 4 legs than 2, yet somehow still bipedal. My lungs burned with each breath of the cold night air, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but raw fear kept me moving. The sound of my own panicked breathing mixed with the creature's pursuit created a nightmarish soundtrack that I knew would haunt my dreams for years to come. Through the panic and exhaustion, I suddenly burst out of the woods into a small clearing. There, like something out of a horror movie, stood an old cabin, its weathered logs half collapsed and covered in thick curtains of ivy. I didn't remember seeing it on my way in. In fact, I was fairly certain I'd wandered far from my original trail, but in that moment it represented my only hope for survival. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out into the night, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I ran inside, using what little strength I had left to slam the door shut behind me. The interior of the cabin was pitch black and thick with the musty smell of decay and abandonment. Years of rain and snow had seeped through the deteriorating roof, leaving the wooden floorboards soft and rotting in places. My hands trembled as I frantically searched the walls near the door, finding an old piece of lumber, what might have once been part of a support beam. I wedged it against the door, praying it would hold. The wood was damp and partially rotted, but it was better than nothing. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the far wall, trying to make myself as small as possible in the darkness. I stood there, struggling to control my breathing, straining my ears for any sound from outside. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers settling. That silence was somehow worse than the sounds of pursuit had been. In the corner I spotted an old oil lamp on a shelf, covered in years of dust and cobwebs. My hand shook so badly it took 3 attempts to light it with the matches I kept in my jacket pocket. The dim light cast dancing shadows on the walls, transforming innocent shapes into lurking monsters, but it was better than the suffocating darkness. Trying to think like a survivor, I searched the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. The place had obviously been abandoned for decades. Old newspapers from the 1960s littered the floor, their headlines long faded into illegibility. In a corner cabinet I found a rusty hunting knife, its blade dulled by time but still potentially useful. I gripped it tightly, the handle slick with my own sweat. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, marked only by the erratic beating of my heart and the steady drip of water from somewhere in the ceiling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I was a practical man, someone who believed in the tangible world of metal and mechanics. But what I'd encountered in those woods defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The creature's image was burned into my memory, those impossibly long limbs, that gaunt frame, those glowing eyes that spoke of an ancient, terrible hunger. Deep down, I knew I'd encountered something that shouldn't exist in our world, something that the old stories warned about but modern minds dismissed as superstition. The sudden sound of claws scraping against wood shattered my thoughts. At first it was gentle, almost exploratory, like something testing the door's strength. Then it grew more insistent, more desperate. The beam I'd placed across the door shuddered with each impact. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white with tension. The door began to splinter, tiny cracks appearing in the weathered wood. I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. Desperation forced me to think clearly for the first time since entering the cabin. I looked around frantically and spotted a small window in the back, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit. It would be a tight fit, but it might be my only chance. I moved as quietly as I could, wincing at every creaking floorboard beneath my feet. The scratching at the door grew more frantic, accompanied now by a low guttural sound that made my blood run cold, something between a growl and a human moan, but somehow worse than either. Just as I reached the window, the door exploded inward with a deafening crash. The beam went flying across the room like it was made of paper. There, framed in the doorway, stood the creature. In the flickering lamplight, it was even more terrifying than before. Its skin was a sickly pale color that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, stretched too tight over its skeletal frame. Those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. The thing's mouth opened, revealing rows of yellowed, sharp teeth, and it let out that same horrible sound I'd heard before, a noise that spoke of centuries of hunger and countless hunts through these dark woods. I didn't think. I couldn't think. Pure survival instinct took over. I dove through the window, feeling the old glass shatter around me. Pain shot through my shoulder and ankle as I landed hard on the frozen ground outside, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the warm trickle of blood down my arm from where the glass had cut me. The creature was right behind me. I could hear it squeezing through the window, its joints making sickening popping sounds as it contorted its unnaturally long limbs through the small opening. The forest seemed different now, twisted and wrong, like a familiar face distorted in a funhouse mirror. The trees appeared to lean in toward me as I ran, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. My flashlight was long gone, lost somewhere during my initial flight through the woods, but the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, hear its footfalls getting closer. Its breath, when it got near enough, was cold and carried the sweet, sour stench of decay. Finally, through the trees, I saw something that made my heart leap, a break in the forest and the faint glow of artificial light. I burst out onto a dirt road, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. In the distance, I could see the warm yellow glow of windows in an old farmhouse. I ran toward it like it was salvation itself, each step feeling like it might be my last. The gravel crunched under my feet as I covered the final distance to the house's porch. I pounded on the door with what little strength I had left, yelling for help. The door opened to reveal an elderly man, his weathered face a mix of confusion and concern. Later I would learn his name was Walter, and he and his wife Martha had lived on this property for over 40 years. He took one look at my face, then passed me into the darkness, and his expression changed to one of grim understanding. "Get inside, quick," he said, and I didn't need to be told twice. As soon as I was through the door, he shut and bolted it, then handed me a shotgun that had been leaning against the wall. "If something comes through that door," he said simply, "you shoot." Martha brought me a glass of water with trembling hands, her eyes never leaving the windows. I told them what happened, every detail still vivid in my mind, and they listened without interruption, their faces growing more serious with each word. When I finished, Walter leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "We've heard stories about something like that," he said softly. "Old tales, you know. Folks around here, especially the elders from the reservation, they call it the Wendigo." The word sent a chill down my spine. I had heard the stories too, warnings passed down through generations. But like most modern folks, I had dismissed them as superstition. Now I knew better. We sat in that farmhouse kitchen through the longest night of my life. The only sound was the steady ticking of an old clock on the mantel, marking each endless minute. Walter kept his shotgun ready, and every now and then Martha would get up to peer out the windows. The hours crawled by until finally exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a restless sleep on their couch. When I woke, the sun was rising, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. Walter hadn't moved from his chair, the shotgun still across his lap. "You all right, son?" he asked quietly. "Yeah, I think so," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Walter offered to drive me back to town in his old pickup truck. As we drove, I couldn't help looking back at the forest, half expecting to see that tall, gaunt figure watching us from between the trees. But there was nothing except the morning mist rising from the ground. When we reached my place, I thanked Walter and went inside, locking every door and window, though deep down I knew locks wouldn't stop something like what I'd encountered. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking horror. I kept the knife I'd taken from the cabin close by and bought a shotgun of my own, though I doubted either would do much good if the creature ever came back. I threw myself into my work at the garage, trying to lose myself in the familiar world of engines and machinery, where everything had a logical explanation and could be fixed with the right tools. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal, but I was changed. I never went back into those woods, not even in broad daylight. I sold my hiking gear and took up indoor hobbies instead. When customers would tell stories about strange sounds in the forest or livestock going missing, I'd find excuses to leave the room. I never told anyone else what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I kept in touch with Walter and Martha, stopping by their farm every few months, though we never directly spoke about what had happened. The understanding was silent but mutual. Years later, I heard about a hiker who went missing in those same woods. The search parties found nothing, no body, no equipment, not even tracks. It brought all the memories rushing back, and I realized that maybe the old stories weren't just stories after all. Maybe there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, ancient things that still roam the dark places of the earth. Sometimes late at night, when the wind blows through the trees and the shadows grow long, I still hear that sound. That terrible, hungry sound that's neither human nor animal. And I wonder if it remembers me, if it's still out there, waiting. I've thought about moving away, starting fresh somewhere else, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's because I know now what lurks in the darkness, and somehow that's better than not knowing. Or maybe it's because deep down, I understand that some things you can't run from, no matter how far you go. I still work at my garage, fixing cars and trucks like I always have. Life goes on, but I never hike anymore, and I always make sure I'm home before sunset, because even though I haven't seen it since that night, I know it's still out there in those woods. And sometimes knowledge is the heaviest burden of all. This happened to me in 1969. My name is Noah Eaglefeather, park ranger for the past 10 years at Yosemite National Park. I've always loved the outdoors, the quiet, the solitude. It's in my blood. My grandfather was a mountain man, or so the stories go. He spent his life traversing these same peaks and valleys, learning their secrets, respecting their power. I followed in his footsteps, finding peace in the whisper of wind through ancient pines and the distant cry of eagles. But that peace was shattered one autumn day when everything I thought I knew about these woods was challenged. It all started with a missing hiker. While disappearances weren't unusual, folks got lost in the vastness of Yosemite all the time. This one was different. David Matheson was his name, though it took us a while to piece that together from the ID in his abandoned camp. Young guy, a college student from Berkeley working on his thesis about indigenous flora, judging by the detailed notebooks and specialized gear he'd left behind. His campsite told a story that didn't make sense. The tent was neat and properly secured, his backpack meticulously organized with everything in its place, even a half-eaten bag of trail mix sitting on a rock as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. The strange part was there were no signs of struggle, no indication of wildlife interference, no suggestion of foul play. He was just gone. The sheriff, Jim Hawkins, called me up personally, said the family was frantic. David's mother had been calling every day, her voice increasingly desperate as she described her son's reliable nature. his extensive outdoor experience, how this disappearance was completely out of character. They wanted to organize a search, see if we could find any trace of the kid. I gathered a few volunteers, good men who knew these mountains like the backs of their hands, retired rangers, local hunters, and experienced backpackers who understood the terrain's treacherous nature. We scoured the valley methodically for 2 full days, calling his name until our voices grew hoarse, checking every ravine and outcropping, marking our progress on topographical maps. No luck. The only promising lead appeared on the second afternoon, some footprints leading into a particularly dense part of the woods, but they just stopped. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The tracks ended abruptly in soft soil, with no rocks or hard ground nearby to explain the sudden disappearance. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years of tracking, and neither had any of the other experienced outdoorsmen in our group. On the 3rd day, I found myself alone. The volunteers had other obligations, families to feed, jobs to return to, lives that couldn't be put on hold indefinitely. But I couldn't let it go. Something about this case kept prickling at the back of my neck, an instinct honed by years in the wilderness, telling me that something was fundamentally wrong. I kept thinking about those footprints, vanishing into thin air, defying every law of nature I knew. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley, painting the granite cliffs in shades of amber and gold when I saw it. A shape, dark against the dying light, moving through the trees with an otherworldly fluidity. It was too big to be a bear, too fluid to be a deer, and too deliberate in its movements to be any known predator. My first thought was that it might be another searcher, but something about its motion set off every alarm bell in my seasoned ranger's mind. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I followed it, my years of tracking experience allowing me to move quietly through the underbrush. The woods were incredibly dense in this section, the ancient pines growing so close together that sunlight barely penetrated their canopy. The air was thick with the heavy smell of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something musty and foreign that I'd never encountered before in all my years in these woods. The shape moved silently ahead of me like a whisper in the wind, weaving between the trees with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. I kept my distance, moving cautiously, every sense heightened by adrenaline and years of wilderness experience. My hand hovered over the rifle strapped across my back, though some deep instinct told me that conventional weapons might be useless against whatever I was following. Then, in a small clearing where the dying sunlight managed to pierce the canopy, I saw it clearly for the first time. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. It was humanoid, but definitely not human. The creature stood easily 7 feet tall, with long, lanky limbs that seemed to bend in ways that defied normal anatomy. Its skin was a mottled gray color that seemed to shift and change like shadow on water, almost blending into the darkness between the trees. It moved with an unsettling grace, its head cocked to the side in an almost bird-like manner, as if listening to something in the forest that my human ears couldn't detect. I froze in place, my breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the creature must hear it. This wasn't some lost hiker or unknown species of bear. This was something else entirely, something primal and ancient that didn't belong in our modern world, something terrifying that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural order. I began to back away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. Then it turned its head, and I swear it looked right at me with eyes that were black and empty, like bottomless pits in the universe. In that moment, I felt a jolt of pure primal fear run through me, cold and sharp as an icicle through my heart. All my years of wilderness training disappeared in an instant, replaced by raw animal instinct. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth with none of my usual care for stealth, the creature's otherworldly gaze burning into my back. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, my lungs burning and legs trembling. My cabin, a small ramshackle thing tucked away on the edge of the park, had never felt so inadequate as it did that night. Built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, its rough-hewn logs and simple construction had always been a source of comfort, a connection to the park's history. But now, as I slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt, the gaps between the logs seemed like vulnerable points, the windows too fragile, the roof too accessible. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light the kerosene lamp, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed in the silence. Every shadow and every corner seemed to move, to shift, to threaten. I couldn't sleep that night. The cabin's familiar creaks and settlings, sounds that had lulled me to sleep for years, now sent shivers down my spine. The image of the creature, its blank eyes and unsettling grace, was seared into my mind like a brand. I sat in my father's old rocking chair, rifle across my lap, watching the darkness through the windows. The moon cast long shadows across my floor, and more than once I caught myself staring at them, searching for movement, for any sign of that unnatural fluidity I'd witnessed in the woods. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt almost foolish. Daylight has a way of making nighttime terrors seem distant, less real. But I knew what I'd seen. After a breakfast I barely tasted, I grabbed my gear and headed back to the spot where I'd encountered the creature. The morning dew still clung to the undergrowth, and the forest was alive with normal sounds: birdsong, squirrels chattering, the distant call of a hawk. Everything seemed ordinary until I found the tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen in my decade as a ranger or in all the tracking books I'd studied. Long, narrow footprints with 3 toes, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. Using my hand for scale, I photographed them with my old Kodak camera, carefully placed a ruler beside them for reference. They led deeper into the woods, towards the most remote, inaccessible part of the park, an area we called the Devil's Pocket, where the terrain was so rough and the vegetation so dense that even experienced hikers avoided it. When I reported back to Sheriff Hawkins, showing him the photographs and describing the creature, he listened with the patience of a man who'd known me for 20 years. His office, with its coffee-stained desk and yellowing maps on the walls, felt almost surreal after what I'd experienced. "Noah," he said finally, running a hand through his graying hair, "you know there are bears in these woods, big ones. The light plays tricks at sunset, and after 2 days of searching—" But I cut him off, spreading the photographs across his desk. "Jim, look at these tracks. Tell me what kind of bear makes prints like these." He studied them, his forehead furrowed, that patient expression slowly giving way to confusion. Yet I could see he wasn't ready to accept what I was suggesting. He patted my shoulder, gave me a look that mixed pity with concern. "Get some rest, Noah," he said. "You've been through a lot." I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come out right. I knew how I sounded, like a crazy old man ranting about monsters in the woods. But I couldn't let it go. Something was out there, something that had taken the hiker, something that didn't belong in our world. Days turned into weeks, and the fear evolved into a gnawing obsession. I spent my free time in the county library, studying animal tracks, reading every book I could find on local legends, searching for anything that might shed light on what I'd seen. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, started saving newspaper clippings for me. Anything about unusual sightings or unexplained events in the park's history. One day, buried in a stack of yellowing papers from the 1920s, I found something that made my blood run cold. The article was from the Yosemite Valley Gazette, dated October 15, 1924. It contained a blurry photograph of a footprint in mud, remarkably similar to the ones I'd photographed. The accompanying story spoke of strange sightings near Mirror Lake, of unexplained disappearances, of whispers about a creature that moved through the shadows. The writer, a local reporter named Samuel Wright, had interviewed several witnesses, hunters, trappers, and a Native American elder who spoke of ancient warnings about certain parts of the valley that should be left undisturbed. This time, when I went to Sheriff Hawkins, he didn't dismiss me outright. He studied the old article, comparing it to my photographs, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "This is interesting, Noah," he said slowly, reaching for his phone. "Let me make some inquiries." He was true to his word. Over the next few days, he contacted other law enforcement agencies, park services in neighboring states, even reached out to some contacts in the FBI. What he uncovered was disturbing. There had been reports, similar sightings, going back decades. Nothing concrete enough to make headlines, mostly dismissed as tall tales or hysteria, but there was a pattern. disappearances in remote areas, unusual tracks, glimpses of something that didn't quite fit any known species. The sheriff's findings were enough to warrant a closer look. He contacted the National Park Service, requesting additional resources for what he carefully termed an unknown wildlife investigation. Within a week, a team of specialized rangers arrived from Washington State. They brought with them equipment I'd never seen before: high-sensitivity motion detectors, infrared cameras, recording devices that could pick up sounds beyond human hearing range. The team was led by Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with experience tracking unknown species in remote areas. She took my account seriously, asking detailed questions about the creature's movement patterns, its physical characteristics, its apparent behavior. We set up a grid pattern of monitoring stations throughout the Devil's Pocket, each equipped with multiple cameras and sensors. The other rangers, at first professionally skeptical, started to share my unease as the days passed. The woods felt different, heavier, as if something intelligent was watching us from the shadows. Equipment malfunctioned in specific areas, batteries drained inexplicably, and we found strange patterns of broken branches that defied natural explanation. Then, on a cold November night, it happened. One of the motion sensor cameras captured something moving through the darkness. The footage was grainy, infrared green but unmistakable, a tall, fluid figure moving with that same unnatural grace I'd witnessed. Dr. Chen was ecstatic, staying up all night analyzing the footage frame by frame, but her excitement was short-lived. The next morning we found her body by Bridleva Creek. The scene was horrific. Her body twisted at impossible angles, limbs bent backward, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The official report would later attribute her death to a wildlife attack. But those of us who saw her knew better. No bear or mountain lion could have done what was done to her. The marks on her body, the way she was positioned, it was almost ritualistic, a display of power and otherworldly savagery. The news spread quickly through the valley. Tourists canceled reservations, locals kept their children indoors, and an atmosphere of fear settled over the park like a heavy fog. The National Park Service officially closed Yosemite for environmental assessment, but the real reason was clear to everyone involved. A team from the FBI's Special Investigations Unit arrived, led by agents who specialized in unexplained phenomena. They brought more sophisticated equipment, set up a command center, conducted interviews with everyone who'd had even the slightest unusual experience in the park. But it was too late. The creature had gone to ground. Despite weeks of searching, despite all the technology and expertise assembled, we found nothing but traces. A few more tracks, some twisted branches, areas where nothing would grow and animals wouldn't go. The investigation was eventually called off. The park reopened with new wildlife safety regulations that required visitors to stay on marked trails and leave the area before sunset. Years have passed since then. I still work these woods, though I requested a transfer to day shifts only. The official reports all list Sarah's death as an animal attack. David Matheson is missing, presumed dead from exposure. But I know the truth. On certain nights when the moon is hidden and the winds blow cold from the high peaks, I hear movement in the darkness. Something still walks these woods, ancient and other, moving like a shadow among the trees. I keep my rifle closer now, though I doubt it would do much good. The creature is still out there, watching, waiting, and sometimes in my darker moments, I wonder if it's not just watching me, but studying us all, learning our ways, biding its time. I've never told this story publicly before. Who would believe it? But I'm getting older now, and I feel these things need to be recorded, need to be remembered. If you're reading this and you plan to visit Yosemite, stick to the trails, stay in the light, and most importantly, if you feel watched, if you sense something moving in the shadows that doesn't move quite right, don't follow it. Don't let curiosity get the better of you like I did. Some mysteries in this world are better left unexplored. Some corners of wilderness better left undisturbed. Because out there, in the deepest parts of these ancient woods, something waits that defies our understanding of what is natural and what is other. And it's patient, so very patient. my name is John Anderson, and the mountains have always been in my blood. I've spent most of my life in the woods, not as a survivalist or anything glamorous like that, but because I just can't stand the cacophony of city life, the endless drone of traffic, the artificial glare of streetlights, the constant hum of humanity pressing in from all sides. My grandfather was a logger in the old days, when men still wielded axes and cross-cut saws, before the whine of chainsaws became the symphony of the forest. He left us this weathered cabin up in the Colorado mountains, a testament to craftsmanship that stood for nearly 8 decades, its rough-hewn logs darkened by time and weather. I grew up there learning the ways of the forest through the patient teachings of my grandfather, the sound of chainsaws biting into pine, the sticky sweetness of sap on my hands, and the quiet wisdom that only comes from living close to the land. These days I've settled into a small Midwestern town, working as a carpenter and trying to make peace with the compromises of modern life. But every summer without fail, I make the pilgrimage back to that old cabin, seeking solitude and the kind of silence you can only find when you're miles from the nearest power line. It's become my ritual, my way of reconnecting with something ancient and true that seems to be slipping away from the world a little more each year. This particular summer, though, this one was different. It was mid-July when I decided to make the trip earlier than usual. The heat in town had been oppressive, turning the streets into shimmering mirrors of desperation, and I felt the mountains calling with an urgency I couldn't ignore. The sun was riding high in a perfectly cloudless sky when I loaded up my old Ford F-150, the kind of crisp, clean day that makes you believe in the possibility of new beginnings. I packed carefully, enough supplies for 2 weeks, though I only planned to stay for 1, my grandfather's old toolbox that had seen generations of repairs, and my constant companion, Duke. He's an aging mutt with a coat the color of storm clouds and eyes that seem to hold all the wisdom of the wilderness. We found each other at a shelter 5 years ago, and since then he's been my shadow, my protector, and my closest friend in the quiet hours. The drive up to the cabin was like traveling back in time, watching the trappings of civilization fall away mile by mile. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that seemed to remember every vehicle that had ever passed, their ruts deep enough to swallow a compact car whole. I turned off the main Forest Service road onto the narrow track that led to the cabin, the one my grandfather had carved out of the wilderness decades ago. Duke's head snapped up from where he'd been dozing, his ears suddenly alert, eyes scanning the thick forest on either side. At the time, I dismissed it as his usual excitement at arriving, but looking back now, I wonder if he sensed something even then, some disturbance in the natural order of things that my human senses were too dull to detect. The cabin appeared exactly as it had always been, standing sentinel in its small clearing, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the towering pines. The rough wooden steps creaked their familiar welcome under my boots, the sound unchanged since my childhood. Duke bounded out of the truck with the energy of a much younger dog, his nose working overtime as he reacquainted himself with the territory. I watched him trot off into the surrounding woods, knowing he wouldn't go far. He never did. That first evening settled into a rhythm as familiar as breathing. I built a fire in the stone pit my grandfather had constructed, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin's weathered walls. The meal was simple, beans and sausages cooked in a cast-iron skillet that had probably seen the Civil War, accompanied by a cold beer and the kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. The only sounds were the gentle pop and crack of burning wood, the occasional hoot of a great horned owl, and Duke's contented sighing as he lounged at my feet. It felt perfect, like slipping into a favorite pair of well-worn boots. If I'd known then what was coming, I might have savored that moment of tranquility more deeply. The next morning dawned bright and promising, the kind of day that seems to demand exploration. After a breakfast of coffee and bacon, I decided to scout some new hiking trails, maybe find some spots I hadn't discovered in all my years of coming here. The forest was particularly lush that summer, the old growth pines towering overhead like ancient guardians, their branches creating a cathedral ceiling of green. I grabbed my day pack, filled a couple of water bottles, and clipped Duke's leash to my belt, though I rarely needed to use it. He knew these woods almost as well as I did, and his instincts were usually sharper than mine. We spent hours wandering through the wilderness, crossing clear mountain streams where Duke would stop to drink and splash, scrambling over fallen logs covered in thick moss, and following game trails that wound through stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. The day was perfect, warm enough to make you appreciate the cool shadows under the trees, but not so hot that the hiking became a chore. The forest was alive with sound, the chatter of squirrels, the harsh cry of ravens, the gentle rustle of wind through the canopy far above. It was late afternoon when everything changed. We had pushed further than usual into a part of the forest I didn't know well, when Duke suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went rigid, hackles rising along his spine like a wave of fear made visible. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, in a small natural clearing, was what remained of someone's campsite, or rather, what looked like the aftermath of violence. 2 tents lay in shreds, as if they'd been attacked by something with impossible strength and razor-sharp claws. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, some of it broken beyond repair, some of it stained with something dark that made my heart race. But it was the trail leading away from the site that made my blood run cold, a series of dark red droplets, still wet enough to catch the late afternoon sun like rubies. Standing there at the edge of the clearing, I felt the weight of isolation pressing in from all sides. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone. 3 bars, a miracle in these parts. Sheriff Jim Greer's number was still in my contacts from years of checking in during my summer stays. He picked up on the second ring, his voice gruff but alert, carrying the authority of his 20 years wearing the badge. "Ellis, don't usually hear from you this time of year." The familiar way he used my last name brought a moment of normalcy to the surreal situation. My voice sounded strange in my own ears as I described the scene before me. "Jim, I found something up here, a campsite, but it's destroyed. There's blood, and..." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. "It looks fresh." The silence on the other end lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. When Greer spoke again, his voice had shifted into something harder, more professional. "Give me your exact location. Don't touch anything. Don't move from where you are unless you're in immediate danger." "I'm coming up with a team." While we waited, the forest seemed to close in around us. Duke stayed pressed against my leg, his muscles tense, occasionally letting out low growls at shadows I couldn't quite see. The sun was dipping behind the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But here, in this clearing with its evidence of violence, the fading light only added to the growing sense of wrongness. I heard their vehicles before I saw them, the deep rumble of engines pushing up the mountain roads. Sheriff Greer arrived first in his department SUV, followed by 2 deputy cruisers. They emerged from their vehicles like warriors preparing for battle, tactical vests over their uniforms, hands resting near their service weapons. Greer himself looked exactly as I remembered him, tall and solid as an old growth pine, with gray beginning to streak his dark beard. But there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of concern and recognition that made my stomach twist. "Show me," he said simply, and I led them to the clearing. The deputies spread out, their flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness like searchlights. Greer crouched by the blood trail, his expression grim. He pulled out a small digital camera and began documenting everything, his movements precise and practiced. "This isn't the first one," he said finally, standing up with a grunt. "We've had reports, strange things happening in these woods over the past month. Hikers gone missing, camps found abandoned, but nothing this violent." He turned to face me directly. "John, I need you to go back to your cabin, lock the doors, stay inside. We're going to search the area, see if we can find whoever did this." I wanted to argue, to insist on helping, but the authority in his voice brooked no argument. As I turned to leave, he caught my arm. "And John, if you hear anything at all, you call immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." The walk back to the cabin seemed to take hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. Every shadow held potential threats. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. Duke stayed close, his body language telegraphing his anxiety. The familiar outline of the cabin when it finally appeared through the trees was the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. Inside, I double-checked every window, every door. I loaded my grandfather's old Winchester rifle, more a comfort than a realistic defense, and sat in the ancient rocking chair by the window, Duke at my feet. The hours crept by, marked only by the steady tick of the old clock on the mantel and the occasional crackle of radio traffic from the search teams. It was just past midnight when everything went to hell. The radio traffic had been steady but routine until then, teams checking in, coordinates being shared, the methodical search of the surrounding forest. Then came the burst of static, followed by a voice tight with panic. "Shots fired. Officer down. We need immediate—" The transmission cut off in a burst of static. My blood ran cold. Duke was already on his feet, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Against all logic, against Greer's direct order, I knew I had to go. These were good men out there, men I'd known for years, and they were in trouble. I grabbed the rifle, checked the ammunition one more time, and headed out into the darkness. The forest at night was a different world entirely. Shadows had substance, movement had meaning, and every sound carried potential danger. I followed the direction of the last radio transmission, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. Duke led the way, his nose working overtime, his body tense and alert. We found the second clearing purely by accident, or perhaps Duke led us there deliberately. The scene that greeted us would haunt my dreams for years to come. Sheriff Greer lay motionless on the ground, his flashlight still clutched in one hand, creating a lone beam of light that cut through the darkness. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the moonlight. The deputies were nowhere to be seen. That's when I heard it, a sound no human throat should be able to make, somewhere between a laugh and a growl. It came from behind me, and I turned slowly, rifle raised, to face whatever horror awaited in the darkness. The figure that stepped into the moonlight was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, but it was the eyes that caught me, wild, feral, yet undeniably human. They held a kind of madness that spoke of something broken beyond repair. In his hand, he held something that glinted dully in the moonlight, a hunting knife, its blade darker than it should have been. "You shouldn't have come here, Ellis," he said, his voice a rough growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primitive. "This is my forest now." I recognized him then, or rather I recognized what was left of him. Marcus Kendall, a local who'd gone missing 3 years ago. There'd been searches, of course, but everyone had assumed he'd fallen into one of the many ravines that scarred the mountainside. Looking at him now, I realized that whatever had survived out here these past years, it wasn't entirely Marcus anymore. He moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in what seemed like a single heartbeat. The rifle came up automatically, years of hunting with my grandfather taking over. The shot echoed through the trees like thunder, sending birds exploding from their roosts. Marcus staggered, looked down at his chest with an almost confused expression, then fell. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the night creatures had gone quiet, as if holding their breath. I approached cautiously, Duke at my side, but Marcus was gone. Whatever remained of the man I'd once known had finally found its rest. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, questions, and paperwork. Sheriff Greer had survived, barely, and would spend months recovering. The full story came out gradually, how Marcus had apparently survived his initial disappearance, but had lost his grip on sanity in the process. How he'd begun targeting campers and hikers, living off the land and becoming something more animal than man. I sold the cabin the following spring. Some places, no matter how much history they hold, become too heavy with memories to keep. Duke and I moved to a small house closer to town, where the nights are never quite as dark, and help is always just a phone call away. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I can still hear the whispers of the forest. And in my dreams I see those eyes, human eyes gone wild with madness, watching me from the darkness between the trees. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also change those who dare to live too long in their shadows. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it's one I'll never forget. This happened to me in 1960. and even now, decades later, my hands shake as I write this account. My name is Ethan Oakenshield, and let me tell you, folks in my line of work see some strange stuff. I've spent 21 years as a park ranger in the Gila National Forest, patrolling its vast wilderness in southwestern New Mexico. 21 years of sun-baked trails, towering pines, and nights so dark you could lose yourself in them. The forest became my home, every ridge and valley as familiar as the lines on my weathered face. But in the spring of 1960, everything changed. The forest I thought I knew revealed a darkness I never could have imagined. It started with the disappearances, hikers mostly. The pattern was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. A group of college students from Silver City went out for a day trip, never came back. Then a retired couple from Arizona, their campsite found intact but empty. A week later, a pair of hunters vanished. Their truck discovered abandoned near the Gila cliff dwellings, rifles still locked inside. The disappearances didn't fit any pattern we'd seen before. Usually, when people go missing in the wilderness, there are signs. Tracks leading off trail, equipment scattered in panic, evidence of animal attacks. But these cases were different. People simply vanished, leaving behind pristine campsites and undisturbed belongings, as if they'd been plucked right out of existence. The Park Service brass tried to rationalize it. They cited statistics about wilderness accidents, talked about mountain lions and black bears, even suggested the possibility of foul play between hikers gone sour. But after 2 decades in these woods, I knew better. There was something different about these disappearances, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I passed through certain sections of the forest. The birds would go quiet, the wind would die, and you'd get this feeling, this overwhelming sense that you were being watched by something ancient and hungry. The findings started appearing in early June. I remember the first one vividly, a single hiking boot, half buried in the mud near Turkey Creek. It wasn't just worn or damaged, it looked chewed, the leather ragged and torn in patterns I'd never seen before. Not like a bear or mountain lion attack, the teeth marks were all wrong, too precise, too methodical. A few days later, I found a backpack about 2 miles upstream. The strap was shredded, its contents scattered across a small clearing and partially consumed. But it was the smell that really got to me. Anyone who's worked in search and rescue knows the smell of death, but this was different. Beyond the typical rot and decay was something else, a metallic acrid stench that burned the nostrils and made your eyes water. I'd never encountered anything like it in all my years in the wilderness. I radioed the findings to headquarters, documented everything meticulously, took photographs with my old Kodak camera. They sent out additional rangers to patrol the area, increased the frequency of aerial surveys, but I could tell they were just going through the motions. Nobody wanted to admit what was becoming increasingly clear to me. Something was hunting in the Gila, something that didn't belong in any wildlife manual or ranger's handbook. The night everything changed, I was pulling firewatch duty up in the Mogollon Mountains. It was late August, and we'd been dealing with one of the worst drought seasons on record. Lightning storms had been rolling through almost nightly, turning the forest into a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. I was posted at Fire Tower 7, an old steel structure that swayed slightly in the stronger gusts. The moon was full that night, casting long shadows through the ponderosa pines. I had my routine down, check the horizons every 15 minutes, log any lightning strikes, and keep the coffee pot warm on my little propane stove. It was just past midnight when I heard it. At first, it sounded like something large moving through the underbrush, a heavy thud followed by the crack of breaking branches. Then, absolute silence. Not just quiet, but that unnatural stillness that makes every instinct scream danger. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out onto the tower's observation platform, sweeping the beam across the moonlit clearing below. The shadows seemed to move and shift, playing tricks with my eyes. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a coyote, but 20 years in the wilderness teaches you to trust your gut. Something was wrong. The coffee grew cold in my cup as I kept watch, my eyes straining against the darkness. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, like a physical weight pressing down on me. Just before dawn, when the sky was beginning to lighten to that pre-sunrise gray, I saw it. The creature was moving through the tree line at the edge of my clearing, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. But what I could see made my blood run cold. It moved on two legs, but not like any bipedal animal I'd ever encountered. Its gait was jerky, almost mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Through my binoculars, I could make out more details that still haunt my dreams. The thing was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its head was disproportionately small, perched atop a thick muscular neck that appeared to have too many vertebrae. But it was the skin that really got to me. In the growing light, I could see it was hairless, with a pale, almost translucent quality that reminded me of cave-dwelling creatures. As I watched, it stopped by a fallen log and bent down in a way that no human spine could manage. It picked something up, a bone, bleached white by the sun, and brought it to what I assumed was its mouth. What happened next defied everything I knew about anatomy, its jaw unhinged like a snake's, opening to an impossible angle, and began methodically stripping the bone of any remaining tissue. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars. In all my years in the Forest Service, I'd never seen anything like this. The creature's movements were both precise and awkward, like it was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at the source of our disappearances. This thing, whatever it was, had been hunting in my forest. When I radioed headquarters, the response was exactly what I'd expected. Station Chief Roundtree's voice crackled over the radio, heavy with skepticism and concern, but not the kind of concern I needed. "Oakenshield," he said, "we've been getting reports about you seeing things, shadows, noises. Hell, you even reported a talking bear last month." That had been a joke, for God's sake, just trying to lighten the mood during a long shift. "You're out there alone too long. Take a few days' leave, clear your head." I knew arguing was pointless. They wouldn't believe me until they saw it themselves, and by then, it might be too late. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. I couldn't sleep without seeing that creature's impossible movements, its inhuman grace as it stripped that bone. I tried to warn people, hikers, campers, the locals who lived on the forest's edge. Most of them listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Old Ethan's finally cracked, they were thinking. Too many years alone in the woods. The confirmation of my fears came 3 weeks later. A young couple from Texas, honeymooners, vanished from their campsite near the Catwalk Recreation Area. Their tent was found shredded from the inside out, their belongings scattered in a way that spoke of violence and desperation. That same metallic stench hung heavy in the air, making the search and rescue dogs whine and refuse to track. This time they couldn't ignore it. The story made the Silver City papers, then spread to Albuquerque and Phoenix. Search parties were organized, helicopters buzzed overhead, but I knew we wouldn't find them. Not alive anyway. I was out in the woods every day, searching areas the others overlooked, following my instincts and 20 years of woodland experience. One afternoon I was following an old game trail near the West Fork of the Gila River when I caught that familiar metallic smell. It was stronger than ever, fresh. I heard a splash, then a sound that I'll never forget, a strangled cry that was almost but not quite human. I ran toward the sound, my service revolver drawn. Bursting through a thicket of willows, I came face to face with my nightmare. The creature was hunched over by the riverbank, its pale back rippling with muscles that moved in ways that defied physics. It was feeding on something, and the sounds, the wet, tearing sounds, will stay with me until the day I die. Without thinking, I let out a yell, equal parts rage and terror. The thing whirled around with impossible speed. Its face, if you could call it that, was a nightmare of adaptation, a predator's features stretched and distorted into something that barely passed for natural. Its eyes were huge, black, and utterly empty, like looking into wells of midnight. What I'd thought was its mouth was actually a complex arrangement of mandibles, now dripping with fresh gore. It dropped its prey. I forced myself not to look too closely at the mangled mass and focused those terrible eyes on me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I was frozen, my gun forgotten at my side, as ancient instincts screamed at me to run. Then it moved. The attack was so fast I barely saw it, One moment the creature was by the river, the next it was on me, its weight driving me to the ground. I felt its claws rake across my face, white-hot pain exploding behind my eyes. I fought back purely on instinct, my fists connecting with its oddly rigid flesh. It felt wrong, too hard in some places, too yielding in others, like hitting a corpse that hadn't quite figured out it was dead. The creature let out a shriek that no earthly being should be able to produce, a high-pitched, multi-toned sound that made my teeth vibrate in their sockets. It reared back, giving me just enough space to scramble away. I managed to get to my feet, blood streaming down my face, my vision blurred but focused enough to keep the creature in sight. It stood there, watching me with those terrible eyes, its mandibles working in patterns that seemed almost contemplative. I backed away slowly, never turning my back, until I finally reached the relative safety of the trail. The creature didn't follow, but I could feel its eyes on me the entire way back to the ranger station. When I arrived, bloody and wild-eyed, they finally had to listen. The evidence was carved into my face, 4 parallel gashes that no known animal could have made. They sent out a search party, armed with rifles and tracking dogs. They found the remains by the riverbank, but the creature was long gone. The bodies of the young honeymooners were never recovered. In the months that followed, they found more evidence, strange 3-toed footprints that baffled wildlife experts, unusual marks on trees that suggested something large had been climbing them, and reports of that same high-pitched keening sound echoing through the valleys at night. I'm no longer a ranger. The attack left me with more than just physical scars, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That creature, or others like it, are still out there in the vast wilderness of the Gila. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of that metallic smell, and my scars begin to ache. Something is hunting in those mountains, something that walks on 2 legs and hungers for flesh, and sooner or later it will hunt again. I write this now as a warning. The wilderness holds secrets darker than most people are prepared to face. If you venture into the Gila, stick to the marked trails, travel in groups, and most importantly, if the birds go quiet and you catch that metallic scent on the wind, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because there are things in this world that defy explanation, predators that shouldn't exist, and sometimes the monsters in our nightmares turn out to be all too real. Ethan Oakenshield, former senior ranger, Gila National Forest, Silver City, New Mexico. My name is Liam Thundercloud, and this happened to me back in 1994. I was living in a small town in Montana working as a forest ranger. The job was quiet, and that suited me just fine. I grew up in these mountains, raised by my father, who was also a ranger before me. The endless expanse of pine-covered slopes and crystal-clear streams had always been more of a home to me than any 4 walls could ever be. I enjoyed the solitude of the mountains, the smell of pine in the air, and the feeling of being a part of the natural world. After serving 4 years in the Army, this peaceful life was exactly what I needed, until that one summer when everything changed. I had a small cabin nestled deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town, a place called Bear Creek that barely qualified as a dot on the map. The cabin wasn't much, but it was home, a sturdy log structure my father had helped me rebuild 5 years earlier. The place was rustic, with a wood-burning stove, a couple of rooms, and a wraparound porch where I could sit and watch the stars at night. Solar panels provided enough electricity for the basics, and a natural spring nearby gave me all the fresh water I needed. The forest was my backyard, and I knew every trail, every ridge, and every hollow within my jurisdiction like the back of my hand. Most evenings I would sit on that porch after my patrols, drinking a cold beer and listening to the symphony of the forest, the haunting call of whip-poor-wills, the gentle rustle of aspens in the breeze, and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. One such evening in late June, I was sitting on my porch, sipping a cold moose drool beer and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The day had been unusually hot, and the evening brought with it a heavy stillness that made the air feel thick and oppressive. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. Not the gradual quieting you sometimes get when a predator passes through, but an absolute, almost vacuum-like silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical force. But I'll never forget what happened in those Montana woods. It's a part of me now, a dark chapter in my life that I'll carry with me forever. These days I fly bush planes in Alaska, and sometimes when I'm soaring over endless forests, I catch myself scanning the trees below, looking for something moving in the shadows. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and the forest goes silent, that absolute unnatural silence that makes your skin crawl, don't try to be a hero. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because some things in this world aren't meant to be understood, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Sometimes people ask me if I've ever shown anyone the photographs I took that night. Truth is, I did take pictures. My old Nikon camera was always with me on patrol, but when I developed the film a week later, the images came out strange. In most of them, there was just a dark, elongated blur where the creature should have been, like something was interfering with the camera. The one clear shot I got, the final image of the creature lying dead in the clearing, disappeared from my desk at the ranger station the day after I submitted my official report. The investigation that followed was peculiar, to say the least. Men in dark suits showed up within hours of my radio call, before even the local sheriff arrived. They wore government badges I didn't recognize and spoke in clipped, efficient tones. They asked me detailed questions about the creature's behavior, its movements, whether it had tried to communicate. They seemed particularly interested in the way it had responded to my rifle shots, making me describe again and again exactly where I'd hit it and how it had reacted. The body itself was loaded into a specially equipped truck with some kind of refrigeration unit. I overheard one of the suits talking about maintaining tissue viability and preventing cellular degradation. They took soil samples from where the creature had fallen and even collected bark from trees it had touched. The whole operation had the feel of something that had been done before, like they were following an established protocol. The cover-up was swift and thorough. The official story became that a grizzly bear with a rare genetic condition had been responsible for the deaths. They even brought in a dead bear from somewhere else and displayed it at the ranger station as proof. The local paper ran the story on its front page, complete with experts explaining how the bear's condition had made it unusually aggressive. Most people seemed eager to believe it. It was easier than accepting the alternative. But the townspeople who'd seen what I'd seen, who'd lost friends or family to the creature, they knew better. We formed a sort of unofficial support group, meeting at Marge's diner every Thursday night, sharing our stories in hushed voices. There was Tom Jenkins, who'd lost his brother, Sarah Martinez, whose husband had encountered something similar while bow hunting the previous fall, and old Bill Warren, who swore he'd been tracking something strange in these woods since the 1960s. The dreams started about a month after the incident. They weren't normal nightmares. They felt more like memories that weren't mine. I would see vast dark spaces underground, strange geometric structures that seemed to pulse with their own light, and creatures similar to the one I'd killed, but different somehow, more evolved. The dreams always ended the same way, with a sense of something massive stirring deep beneath the Montana earth, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. I started researching, digging through old newspapers and local histories. I found patterns, clusters of disappearances going back decades, always in 7-year cycles. Strange lights in the sky, unexplained cattle mutilations, and stories from the Blackfeet tribe about areas of the forest that their people had always avoided. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that what I'd encountered was just the tip of something much larger and more terrifying. That's why I finally left Montana, not because of fear, though there was plenty of that, but because I couldn't stop looking for answers. It was consuming me. Every time I walked the trails, I was looking for signs. Every time I heard a strange noise in the night, I was reaching for my rifle. I wasn't doing my job anymore. I was hunting, and something told me that if I kept hunting, eventually I would find what I was looking for. Or worse, it would find me. These days, flying over the Alaskan wilderness, I sometimes spot things from my bush plane that don't quite make sense. Strange patterns in the forest, circular clearings that don't appear on any map, shadows that move against the wind. When that happens, I bank hard and fly in the opposite direction. I've learned that there are some mysteries that shouldn't be solved, some questions better left unanswered. But I keep a loaded rifle by my bed, and I never go anywhere without my father's old silver hunting knife. Because deep down, I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of North America, there are more of these creatures. And sometimes late at night when the northern lights are dancing across the sky, I swear I can hear that low, guttural growl carried on the wind, calling me back to the hunt. The end? Maybe. But somehow I don't think so. Not by a long shot. Last month something happened that forced me to break my self-imposed exile from the past. I received a letter from Sarah Martinez, one of the members of our old support group. She'd tracked me down through my bush pilot service in Alaska. The letter was short, but it sent chills down my spine. "They're back, Liam, 7 years, just like you said." I called her that night from my cabin outside Anchorage. Sarah's voice was tight with tension as she told me about the disappearances that had started again in Bear Creek. 3 people gone in the past month, all vanishing from the same general area where I'd encountered the creature. But this time something was different. The bodies weren't being found torn apart like before. They were just gone. What really got my attention was what Sarah said about the forest. The old-timers in town had been reporting strange phenomena, lights moving through the trees at night, electronic devices failing for no reason, and that same unnatural silence I remembered all too well. But the most disturbing detail was what the loggers had found. Perfect circular clearings appearing overnight, the trees not cut or broken, but seemingly dissolved, their stumps turned to a gray, ash-like substance. I'm writing this now from a motel room in Billings, Montana. Tomorrow I'll make the drive to Bear Creek. I told myself I was just going to check on old friends, maybe help Sarah make sense of what's happening. But the rifle in my trunk and the case full of specialized equipment tell a different story. During my time in Alaska, I hadn't been entirely idle. I'd made connections with others who'd had similar experiences, park rangers, bush pilots, tribal elders, and slowly built up a network of people who understood what we were dealing with. One of them, a former government researcher named Dr. Helen Chen, had provided me with some interesting insights. According to her, the creature I encountered wasn't just some random anomaly. It was part of something larger, something that had been on Earth long before humans. She talked about ancient subterranean structures found during deep mining operations, about geological anomalies that defied explanation, and about certain classified government projects that had gone terribly wrong in their attempts to understand what they'd found. The most compelling thing Dr. Chen shared with me was a series of thermal imaging satellites photos taken over the past 50 years. They showed something massive moving deep beneath the surface of North America, following patterns that corresponded exactly with the 7-year cycles of disappearances and strange events. When I overlaid these patterns with the historical data I'd collected, a clear picture emerged. Whatever these things were, they were organized, purposeful, and following some kind of schedule we didn't understand. I'm not the same person who faced that creature in the Montana woods 7 years ago. I'm older now, more prepared, and I understand what I'm dealing with. At least I think I do. The silver knife my father gave me is still strapped to my belt, but it's been joined by other tools, specialized recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, and a few other items Dr. Chen provided that I'm not at liberty to discuss. Sarah's latest message mentioned that the government men were back too, different faces, but the same dark suits, the same clipped tones, the same questions. They've been buying up land around the area where I encountered the creature, setting up what they claim is a wildlife research station. But the satellite dishes aren't pointed at the sky, and the heavy equipment they're bringing in looks more suited for mining than wildlife research. Tomorrow I'll see for myself what's happening in Bear Creek. Part of me hopes I'm wrong about all of this, that there's some rational explanation for everything. But as I sit here in this motel room, watching the sun set behind the mountains I once called home, I can feel it in my bones. Something is stirring in those ancient forests, something that's been waiting, growing, preparing, and this time I don't think a silver knife and a hunting rifle will be enough. Personal note: I'm leaving this account with my lawyer along with detailed files and coordinates. If you're reading this, it means either I haven't returned from Bear Creek, or what I found there was too important to keep quiet. To anyone who encounters something similar, remember what I learned the hard way. They're not just random predators. They're intelligent, organized, and they've been here far longer than us. The real question isn't what they are. It's what they're preparing for. Bear Creek has changed. The small town I remember with its single main street and familiar faces has been transformed. The government wildlife research station dominates the northern edge of town, a sprawling complex of prefab buildings surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Military-grade cameras track every movement along the perimeter, and unmarked black SUVs patrol the access roads day and night. Sarah met me at Marge's diner, though Marge herself is long gone. The place is called Creekside Cafe now, run by Marge's nephew, who eyes strangers with well-earned suspicion. Sarah's hair has gone gray, but her eyes still carry that sharp intelligence I remember. She brought files, dozens of them. Missing persons reports, geological surveys, electromagnetic anomaly readings taken by amateur researchers, but most disturbing were the photographs. These were taken 3 weeks ago, she said, sliding them across the table. The images showed those circular clearings she'd mentioned, but seeing them made my blood run cold. They formed a pattern, a massive spiral spanning miles of forest, visible only from above. At the center was a depression in the earth, perfectly circular, like something massive had pushed its way up from below. Dr. Chen's satellite data makes more sense now. The thermal imaging showed movement patterns that seemed random at first, but when overlaid with these new formations, they reveal what looks like a massive network, tunnels or pathways spreading out from multiple points across the northern Rockies. Bear Creek sits at one of the main intersections. The new disappearances are different too. Sarah introduced me to Katie Reynolds, whose husband Mike vanished 2 weeks ago. He was part of the logging crew working near one of the clearings. According to Katie, Mike had been complaining about headaches and strange dreams in the days before he disappeared. Dreams about vast underground spaces and geometric structures that pulsed with light. The same dreams I'd had 7 years ago. But here's what really worries me. The government teams know about the dreams. They've been interviewing families of the missing, specifically asking about sleep disturbances and shared visual phenomena. Dr. Chen warned me about this. She called it psychic contamination, the idea that prolonged proximity to these creatures or their technology, if that's what it is, can affect human consciousness. I set up my equipment in Sarah's spare room, EMF detectors, seismographs, and some more specialized devices Dr. Chen provided. The readings are unlike anything I've seen. There's a pattern to the electromagnetic disturbances, almost like a language. The seismographs show regular vibrations coming from deep underground, far too rhythmic to be natural. Supplemental report. Day 2. Made contact with someone inside the research facility today. Won't mention their name, but they reached out through Sarah. According to them, the government isn't just studying these creatures. They're trying to communicate with them. They've discovered that the electromagnetic patterns are part of a sophisticated communication network. The creatures use it to coordinate across vast distances, possibly even to manipulate their environment at a molecular level, which would explain the dissolved trees. The source also confirmed something Dr. Chen had only theorized. These aren't isolated incidents. Similar facilities have been set up at other hotspots across North America, Europe, and Asia. All coordinating, all following the same patterns of activity, all pointing to something big coming. The dreams are getting stronger now that I'm back. Last night I saw something new, vast chambers deep underground, filled with what looked like translucent pods. Inside each pod was something moving, growing. But what terrified me wasn't their appearance, it was the sense of purpose I felt radiating from them. These creatures aren't just hiding or hunting, they're preparing. Tonight, Sarah's contact is going to help us get inside the facility. They've promised to show us what the government has really discovered about these creatures. I'm recording everything, backing up files to multiple secure locations. If you're reading this, it means either I haven't made it back, or what we found was too important to keep hidden. To anyone who finds this, the 7-year cycle isn't random, it's a countdown, and by my calculations, we're in the final phase. The next entries were found on a damaged laptop recovered from the Bear Creek Wildlife Research Station after the incident of June 15, 2025. Most of the data was corrupted, but fragments remain. Investigation continues. End of recovered document. A series of coordinates follows, along with a complex cipher key and the words, "When they rise, find Dr. Chen. She knows where the sanctuaries are. God help us all." Recovered security footage transcript, Bear Creek Facility, June 15, 2025, 23:47 MT, camera B7, exterior perimeter. 2 figures approach the fence line from the northwest, identified as Thundercloud, Liam, and Martinez, Sarah. Security lighting malfunctions in sequence along the western perimeter. EMF readings spike off measurable scales. Camera C12, interior lab access. Doctor redacted. Meets subjects at keycard entrance. Visible discussion. Doctor redacted. Appears agitated, keeps checking watch. Hands Thundercloud what appears to be a portable hard drive. EMF interference increasing. Camera D3, main laboratory. Subjects enter main lab area. Multiple monitoring stations visible showing thermal imaging of underground structures. Central display shows real-time seismic activity. Patterns match those documented in Thundercloud's previous reports. Doctor redacted. Directing attention to large containment chamber at center of facility. Static interference, 2:13 minutes of footage lost. Camera D3, resumed. Containment chamber appears compromised. Multiple alarms visible. Security teams entering from all access points. Thundercloud and Martinez taking cover behind monitoring stations. Doctor redacted, attempting to access emergency protocols. Recovered audio fragment, time index unknown. Not just one of them. The whole network is activating. They're all rising. Multiple alarm systems audible. Jesus Christ, look at the size. High-pitched electronic interference. Sound of metal stress concrete cracking. Camera E1, emergency exit. Martinez visible helping injured doctor, redacted toward exit. Thundercloud following, carrying hard drive and what appears to be research documentation. Structural damage evident throughout facility. Unknown biological masses visible through breaks in walls floor. Final audio transmission, Bear Creek emergency band. This is Ranger Thundercloud. If anyone receives this, the coordinates in my previous reports mark sanctuary locations. Dr. Helen Chen has the access codes. They're not invading. They're running. Something is coming. Something they're afraid of. Get to the sanctuaries. Get underground. They'll need us as much as we'll need them. This is humanity's last. Transmission ends. Recovered email. Sent June 16, 2025, 4:12 MT. From H. Chen, redacted. Gov 2. Multiple recipients, encrypted. Subject, sanctuary protocol activated, confirmation received from all sites. Pattern matches predictions. Initiating protocol Omega, coordinates follow. Bring this message. Bring weapons. Bring hope. They were never the enemy. They were the warning. God help us all. HC, final note, found in sealed titanium case recovered from Bear Creek site. To whoever finds this, I was wrong about so much, but right about what mattered. The 7-year cycles weren't a countdown to invasion. They were preparation. The creatures, we know what to call them now, but that knowledge comes with too high a price. They've been here longer than us, building, waiting, watching the skies. The pods weren't weapons, they were shelters. The tunnels weren't for invasion, they were for evacuation. They weren't studying us, they were preparing us. Something is coming, something from beyond the dark spaces between stars. The creatures knew. They've been running from it for longer than humanity has existed, building refuges on countless worlds. Earth was just the latest, but this time is different. This time they're making a stand, and they need us as much as we need them. If you're reading this, find Dr. Chen, find the sanctuaries. The survival of 2 species now depends on it. Remember, when the skies go dark, follow the silence, follow the dreams. They'll lead you to safety. And if you hear something in the woods, something that makes your skin crawl and your mind scream, pray it's one of ours. Liam Thundercloud, former forest ranger, current guardian of the dark, June 16, 2025, end document. A series of binary code sequences follows, along with complex mathematical formulae and what appears to be a star chart marked with specific coordinates. The final page contains a single phrase, written in multiple languages, both human and otherwise. Look to the stars, then run. Day 187. Underground. The transition has been harder than anyone expected. 10,000 people living in vast underground chambers built by beings we barely understand. But we're adapting. The creatures, the predecessors as Dr. Chen calls them, have been surprisingly patient teachers. Sarah runs operations now for the entire Northern Sanctuary network. Her experience with the Bear Creek incident made her the perfect choice. She set up a communication system between all 23 North American sanctuaries, using a combination of their technology and ours. It's strange seeing their crystalline communication devices next to our laptops and tablets, but somehow it works. Katie Reynolds, whose husband Mike disappeared during those final days, made a discovery that changed everything. The dreams weren't just dreams, they were attempts at communication. Mike wasn't taken, he was chosen. He's working with a group of others now, learning to interface directly with their biological technology. Yesterday, he helped activate a dormant defense system that spans the entire Pacific coast. Dr. Chen's theories were right. The predecessors have been running for millennia, building these sanctuaries on countless worlds. Earth was supposed to be just another refuge, but something changed. They saw something in us, our adaptability, our resilience, our capacity for both violence and compassion. They decided this was where they'd make their stand. The hard drive from the Bear Creek facility contained their complete history. We now know what's coming, the Void Hunters as they call them. A force that consumes civilizations, that turns living worlds into dead zones. They've been following the predecessors' trail across galaxies. Our solar system is next. But we're ready. The sanctuaries aren't just shelters, they're fortresses, training grounds, and laboratories all in one. The predecessors are teaching us everything they know about particle physics, dimensional engineering, biotechnology. We're learning to use their weapons, to pilot their biomechanical vessels, to think in ways humans never have before. The surface monitoring stations show the first signs. Gravitational anomalies in the Kuiper Belt. Strange radiation patterns. They're coming. But we're not running. Not this time. Not with the combined knowledge of two civilizations and the determination of species fighting for their very existence. Final transmission. Global Sanctuary Network. January 1st, 2026. To all sanctuary sites, Phase 1 complete. All defense systems online. All training protocols initiated. Begin Phase 2. Remember what the old ranger taught us. When you hear something in the dark, don't run. Stand your ground. Fight. Because now we are all guardians of something greater than ourselves. The skies will go dark soon, but we will light them up again. Sarah Martinez, Global Sanctuary Coordinator, former witness, current guardian. Personal note, found in Liam Thundercloud's quarters, Sanctuary Alpha 7. Sometimes late at night in these vast underground chambers, I think back to that evening on my cabin porch when the forest went silent. I was so afraid then, so alone. Now I understand that silence wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a first contact that would save both our species. Tomorrow we take the fight to the stars. The predecessors have shown us how to merge their organic ships with our digital technology. We're stronger together than either species ever was alone. To anyone who finds this, the forest ranger who ran from monsters is gone. In his place stands someone who finally understands that the true measure of humanity isn't in our fear of the dark, but in our courage to face it together with unlikely allies. Look up. We'll be the ones lighting up the night sky. Commander Liam Thundercloud, Earth Defense Force, First Joint Human Predecessor Fleet, end of all recovered documents. In museums across the Sanctuary Network, a simple display can be found. It contains an old forest ranger's badge, a silver hunting knife, and a bottle of moose drool beer. The plaque reads, "Where it all began. Bear Creek, Montana, 1994. I've spent my entire life in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia, where the distinction between civilization and wilderness grows increasingly blurred with each passing mile. Our town, barely visible on most maps, sits like a forgotten outpost at the edge of one of the largest national forests in the region. The poverty here is as deeply rooted as the ancient trees that surround us, with most residents trapped in an endless cycle of minimum wage jobs at Walmart, fast food restaurants, and the two aging grocery stores that somehow survive despite the economic downturn. I'm one of the lucky ones. My work as a freelance technical writer allows me to maintain a comfortable living while staying connected to the outside world through my internet connection. It's a privilege not lost on me, especially when I see childhood friends struggling to make ends meet or watching talented individuals forced to abandon their dreams for more promising horizons in Atlanta or beyond. The massive national forest to the east of our town has always been both our blessing and our curse. Its presence ensures a steady trickle of tourism during the peak seasons, but it also harbors secrets that most visitors never encounter. The hiking trails that wind through its depths are among the most beautiful in the state, though they come with their own set of warnings. Cell phone service disappears about 5 miles in, and the nearest sign of civilization can be hours away depending on your location. The trailhead parking lots tell their own stories of danger. Broken glass sparkles like deadly diamonds in the gravel, silent witnesses to countless break-ins. The locals speak in hushed tones about missing hikers and strange lights, though official reports never seem to acknowledge these occurrences. What's more concerning are the people you sometimes encounter on the Forest Service roads, individuals who seem to appear from nowhere in vehicles that look like they've survived multiple apocalypses. The idea for our ill-fated camping trip came during one of our regular Friday night gatherings at the Rusty Nail, the only bar in town that wasn't completely depressing. Jacob, fresh from a 12-hour shift at Anderson's Auto Repair, was showing off pictures of his new paintball gear on his phone. He'd spent 3 months' worth of overtime pay on a custom-modified Tipman A5, complete with a red dot sight and an expanded hopper system that could hold twice the normal amount of paintballs. "This beauty right here," he'd said, sliding his phone across the scratched wooden table, "is going to make me unstoppable in the field." His enthusiasm was infectious, even though Isaac and I exchanged knowing glances. Jacob had always been like this, diving headfirst into new hobbies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Last year it was rock climbing. Before that it was brewing his own beer, which had resulted in an explosion that nearly took out his garage. Isaac, who'd just finished another grueling week of double shifts at Mountain View Hospital, was barely keeping his eyes open. The dark circles under his eyes had become a permanent feature lately, ever since the hospital cut back on security staff. "Unstoppable, huh?" he mumbled into his beer. "Like that time you were unstoppable at disc golf and ended up stuck in that poison ivy patch for an hour?" The playful bickering continued as it always did, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the unusual autumn heat that had been baking our town for the past week, or maybe it was the third round of drinks hitting harder than usual. Whatever it was, when Jacob suggested combining paintball with camping, it didn't seem like the terrible idea it should have. The planning took on a life of its own. I had my F-150, which I'd recently equipped with new all-terrain tires and a heavy-duty suspension system, perfect for navigating Forest Service roads. Jacob had enough paintball gear to supply a small army, and Isaac, despite his perpetual exhaustion, was an experienced camper who knew how to pack for any situation. We spent the next week gathering supplies. The local Walmart's camping section was picked clean due to the church retreat season, so we had to improvise. Jacob borrowed a massive tent from his cousin, an old military surplus thing that smelled like mothballs and cigarettes but could supposedly sleep 6 people comfortably. Isaac coordinated our food supplies with military precision, insisting on bringing backup propane stoves and enough food to last a week, even though we were only planning to stay one night. I focused on the logistics, studying Forest Service maps and marking potential spots where we could play paintball without disturbing other campers or attracting ranger attention. The forest was vast, and I knew there were plenty of secluded areas where we could set up our game without anyone noticing. Little did I know that this attention to detail would later save our lives. The morning of our departure was unusually foggy, I picked up Jacob first, his garage looking like a paintball supply store had exploded inside it. 3 markers, thousands of rounds of ammunition, compressed air tanks, protective gear. He'd even brought smoke grenades, though I'm pretty sure those weren't strictly legal for civilian use. Isaac was waiting on his front porch when we arrived, surrounded by neat stacks of camping gear. Unlike Jacob's chaos, Isaac's equipment was methodically organized and labeled. He'd even created a detailed inventory list, complete with backup plans for various emergency scenarios. "You never know what might happen out there," he'd said as we loaded his gear into the truck. Those words would come back to haunt me later. The first sign that something was off should have been the fog. It didn't burn off as the day progressed. Instead, it seemed to thicken, clinging to the trees in wispy tendrils that moved against the wind. The drive started normally enough, with Jacob regaling us with stories about his latest workplace drama and Isaac occasionally interjecting with dry commentary from the back seat. We passed through the small towns that dotted the highway leading to the forest entrance. Pine Grove with its single traffic light perpetually stuck on yellow, Miller's Creek where the general store still had gas prices from 2019 painted on its windows, and finally Shadow Valley, which consisted of little more than a post office and a decrepit mini-mart. The paved road ended at the Forest Service station, which was unusually deserted for a weekend. A single piece of paper fluttered on the bulletin board, a notice about bear activity in the area dated 3 months ago. The usual trail maps and warning signs were missing, leaving behind only sun-faded rectangles on the wooden board. Our usual camping spots were typically about an hour's drive into the forest, following well-maintained gravel roads that were regularly patrolled by rangers. But as we approached the first designated camping area, we encountered something unprecedented, a massive gathering that had taken over not just our preferred spot, but every official campsite in the vicinity. The church retreat was unlike anything I'd seen before. RVs of various sizes formed a protective circle around dozens of tents, like some modern-day wagon train. Children in matching yellow t-shirts darted between the vehicles, their laughter carrying an odd echo in the thick air. Adults in pastoral collars moved among the camps, some carrying what looked like survey equipment, though I couldn't imagine what they were surveying. We stopped at the last campsite turnoff, hoping to find some space, but were met by a man in a pristine white suit, unusual attire for camping. He approached our truck with an unnaturally wide smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid this area is reserved," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "The entire section, actually. We're conducting an important spiritual retreat that requires isolation." He kept his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke, rocking slightly on his heels. Jacob started to argue that public camping areas couldn't be reserved like that, but something about the man's steady, unblinking gaze made me interrupt. "No problem," I said quickly. "We'll find somewhere else." As we drove away, I noticed in my rearview mirror that the man remained in the same spot, watching our departure with that fixed smile. This is how we found ourselves pushing deeper into the forest than ever before, following increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. The fog grew denser, and the trees seemed to press closer to the road with each mile. Our cell phones lost signal one by one, first Isaac's budget carrier, then Jacob's, and finally my usually reliable Verizon connection dropped to no service. It was then that we came across the turnoff, a narrow track that didn't appear on any of my Forest Service maps. The entrance was partially blocked by an earthen mound and a fallen metal barrier, its official Forest Service yellow paint peeling to reveal rust-colored metal beneath. Tire tracks over the mound suggested we weren't the first to ignore this deterrent. "I don't know about this," Isaac said from the back seat, his security guard instincts kicking in. Blocked roads usually mean blocked for a reason. Jacob, however, was already excited by the prospect of exploring new territory. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Besides, look at those tire tracks. People clearly use this road all the time." I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, studying the barrier. Something about it seemed off. The way it had fallen seemed too deliberate, too perfectly placed to allow passage while maintaining the appearance of a blocked road. But we were running out of daylight, and the prospect of driving back through the fog in the dark seemed worse than pressing forward. "My truck can handle it," I said finally, shifting into four-wheel drive. "But let's agree, First decent camping spot we find, we take it. No getting picky. As we crossed the earthen mound, I could have sworn I heard a metallic groan from the fallen barrier, as if it were shifting on its own. But when I checked the rearview mirror, everything looked the same as before. The fog swallowed the entrance as soon as we passed it, and we found ourselves on a gravel road that seemed to wind endlessly into the darkening forest. The campsite we discovered appeared innocent enough at first glance. A small creek bubbled nearby, its waters running clear over moss-covered rocks. The clearing was larger than most natural openings in the forest, almost perfectly circular, as if it had been deliberately carved out of the surrounding wilderness. The plywood table nailed to a massive oak tree seemed like typical backwoods furniture, though the blue tarps covering it were newer than you'd expect, their plastic surfaces unmarred by weather or time. As Jacob and Isaac began unloading our gear, I took a moment to scout the perimeter of our site, a habit I'd developed from years of camping in these woods. That's when the oddities began to pile up, each one more disturbing than the last. The trash scattered around the site wasn't the usual camping debris. Mixed among the expected beer cans and food wrappers were dozens of industrial chemical containers. I recognized some from my father's farm supply store, commercial-grade pesticides, industrial solvents, and chemicals I couldn't identify, but whose warning labels made my skin crawl. Many bottles still contained residual liquids that had leaked into the soil, creating patches where nothing grew. "Hey guys," I called out, holding up one of the less dangerous-looking bottles. "I think we should—" My voice trailed off as Jacob emerged from the tree line, his face pale despite the exertion of gathering firewood. "You need to see this," he said quietly, an unusual tone for our normally boisterous friend. He led me to a cluster of trees about 50 yards from our camp. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Every tree in a perfect 30-foot circle had been systematically modified. The bark had been stripped away in precise rings around each trunk, the exposed wood underneath treated with what appeared to be some kind of chemical solution that had turned the natural grain patterns into unnatural spirals. But it was the symbols that truly unnerved me. Intricate patterns carved into the wood that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Isaac joined us, his security guard training evident in his cautious approach and scanning gaze. He pulled out his flashlight, a heavy-duty model he carried during his hospital shifts, and examined the carvings more closely. "These aren't random," he muttered, tracing one pattern with his beam. "They're too precise, too consistent. Look how they line up between trees. It's like they're part of a larger design." He was right. When I stepped back and looked at the whole cluster, the individual markings seemed to form larger symbols that sprawled across multiple trees. The pattern reminded me of circuit boards or astronomical charts, but with an organic, flowing quality that felt wrong somehow. The sound of branches snapping deeper in the forest made us all jump. Twilight was settling in quickly, and the fog had followed us, seeping between the trees in thick tendrils that seemed to avoid touching the marked trees. "We should find another spot," Isaac said firmly, his professional paranoia in full effect. "Something's not right here." But as we turned to head back to the truck, we realized the fog had completely enveloped our campsite. The visibility had dropped to mere feet, and an unseasonable chill had settled over the area. The prospect of navigating unfamiliar forest roads in these conditions was daunting. "It's already getting dark," I reasoned, trying to convince myself as much as them. "We've got weapons, lights, and we're all capable guys. One night here won't kill us." I couldn't have been more wrong. Darkness fell quickly in the clearing, seeming to pool in the spaces between trees like black water. We'd set up our camp with military precision, thanks to Isaac's insistence on proper security protocols. The tent was positioned with clear sight lines to both the road and the creek, our supplies organized for quick access, and we'd established a rough perimeter marked by glow sticks, another of Isaac's security measures that we'd previously mocked but now appreciated. The fire helped push back the darkness, but it also cast dancing shadows that played tricks with our perception. More than once I caught myself staring at what seemed to be movement just beyond the firelight's reach, only to find nothing there when I shined my flashlight toward it. We tried to maintain normalcy through dinner, cooking the elaborate camping meal we'd planned, foil-packed campfire chili that Jacob had spent days perfecting, accompanied by cold beers from our cooler. The familiar routine of camping helped ease some of the tension, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was during a lull in conversation, somewhere around 11, when we first noticed the light. I almost missed it initially, dismissing it as a trick of the fog that still lingered at the edges of our camp. But there was something deliberately artificial about its quality, a pulsing bluish-white glow that emanated from beyond the hill that bordered our clearing. "That can't be another campsite," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't pass any turnoffs, and these roads aren't connected to any other part of the forest." The light had a rhythm to it, a subtle pulsing that seemed to match the tempo of a heartbeat. As we watched, the fog around it began to move in unnatural patterns, spiraling toward the light source as if being drawn in. "Could be poachers," Isaac suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it. "Sometimes they use unusual lights to attract game." But we all knew this was different. The quality of the light was wrong. It didn't illuminate the fog so much as it seemed to pass through it, creating strange refractions that bent in impossible ways. And there was something else, something that took me several minutes to identify. The light cast no shadows, even when it grew bright enough to clearly illuminate the hillside. The combination of rum and curiosity finally overcame our apprehension. Jacob and I decided to investigate, leaving Isaac to watch the camp. We armed ourselves with flashlights, and in a moment of either wisdom or paranoia, our paintball markers. Even though we knew they'd be useless against any real threat, their familiar weight was comforting. The trek toward the light source quickly became an exercise in spatial disorientation. The fog seemed to thicken with each step we took up the hill, but it moved in ways that defied natural air currents. Instead of drifting with the gentle breeze that had been present all evening, it formed distinct patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that held their form for several seconds before dissolving. The marked trees became more numerous as we ascended, their carved symbols seeming to pulse faintly in sync with the distant light. The air grew noticeably colder, and an odd metallic taste filled our mouths, similar to the sensation of licking a battery, but more pervasive. About halfway up the hill, Jacob suddenly stopped. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath and listened intently. The normal forest sounds, insects, wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, had completely ceased. In their place was a low, almost subliminal hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We were perhaps 3/4 of the way up the hill when Jacob tripped over something hidden beneath the leaves. His flashlight beam caught it as he fell. A metal object about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in the same types of symbols we'd seen carved into the trees. But before we could examine it more closely, Jacob's curse echoed through the trees like a gunshot. The light vanished instantly. The sudden darkness was total and absolute, but in that fraction of a second between its disappearance and when we managed to turn our flashlights on, I saw them. Tall, angular shapes that moved with an impossible fluidity, as if they were folding in on themselves as they retreated into the forest. The image lasted less than a second, but it's burned into my memory. Figures that seemed to be made of geometric shapes that shouldn't have been able to connect to each other, moving in ways that violated every law of physics I knew. Our return to camp was a blur of confusion and mounting dread. The forest had changed somehow. Paths that had been clear on our ascent were now choked with underbrush, and familiar landmarks seemed to have shifted position. But nothing could have prepared us for what we found when we finally glimpsed our campsite through the trees. A figure was methodically moving through our camp, its movements jerky and precise like a malfunctioning robot. It wore what appeared to be Isaac's coat, but the way the fabric moved was wrong, as if it were draped over a frame that couldn't quite maintain a human shape. In its hands was one of our paintball markers, but it held the weapon backward, examining it with movements that reminded me of a child trying to mimic adult behaviors without understanding their purpose. We watched, paralyzed, as the figure conducted its strange inspection of our campsite. It would stop at random intervals, its head tilting at angles that should have been anatomically impossible, before continuing its systematic search. The movement pattern was almost mathematical, precise geometric paths that covered every inch of the clearing. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure walked up the road we'd driven in on, its gait switching between unnaturally fluid and jarringly mechanical. As soon as it disappeared into the darkness, we rushed back to camp, only to find Isaac violently ill in the tent, and all our paintball equipment still securely locked in the truck. The decision to flee was unanimous and immediate, driven by a primal fear that overrode any concern about driving in the dark or navigating the treacherous forest roads. We abandoned the tent and most of our gear, grabbing only our essential belongings and throwing them haphazardly into the truck's bed. The fog had grown impossibly thick, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond the truck's headlights. But what truly chilled us was how the fog behaved. It seemed to actively avoid certain areas, creating clear corridors that led deeper into the forest while obscuring the road we needed to follow. When we reached the dirt mound that marked our entrance to this nightmare, we found that the metal barrier had been restored to its original position. But this wasn't a simple case of someone lifting it back into place. The barrier had been welded back onto its posts with precision that would have required industrial equipment. The welds were still cooling, giving off a faint blue glow that matched the mysterious light we'd seen earlier. I didn't hesitate. Using the truck's brush guard, I rammed the barrier at an angle, praying it would break free without damaging my vehicle too severely. The sound of tearing metal was accompanied by an unnatural screech that seemed to come from the barrier itself, a sound no metal should be able to make. That's when we noticed the vehicle following us. It maintained a precise 1,000-foot distance, visible only when the road straightened out enough to see behind us. It never used its lights, but we could see its outline in the moonlight, a dark, angular shape that seemed to shift and change every time we caught a glimpse of it. The pursuit lasted 45 minutes, though it felt like hours. Our follower never attempted to catch up, never deviated from its exact distance, never made any aggressive moves. It simply followed, maintaining that mathematical precision that reminded me of the figure we'd seen in our camp. The fog seemed to move with us, creating a tunnel of clear air around our truck, while obscuring everything else. Inside the cab, none of us spoke. Isaac had stopped vomiting but sat rigidly in the back seat, his security guard training evident in the way he continuously scanned our surroundings. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the passenger side mirror, calling out whenever he caught a glimpse of our pursuer. When we finally reached the paved road, the transition was jarring, like breaking through a membrane into another world. The fog simply stopped at the forest's edge, creating a wall of white behind us. In my rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of our pursuer, its form seeming to ripple and distort before melting back into the forest darkness. The drive home was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. We took a roundabout route back to town, paranoia making us check repeatedly for any signs of pursuit. It wasn't until we were parked in my driveway, the familiar sight of suburban homes surrounding us, that we finally began to process the events of the night. In the years since that night, I've tried to make sense of what happened. The local Forest Service office has no record of a road matching my description, and satellite imagery shows nothing but unbroken forest in the area where we camped. The metal barrier still stands at its original location, showing no signs of the damage we caused during our escape. I've heard stories since then, whispered conversations in local bars about strange lights in the forest, about people who venture too far off the marked trails and return changed, if they return at all. The industrial insecticide bottles have appeared in other locations throughout the forest, always accompanied by trees bearing those same circular scars. Jacob moved away shortly after our experience, taking a job in Atlanta and refusing to discuss that night. Isaac still works security at the hospital but now carries a camera with him at all times, obsessively documenting everything he sees. As for me, I still live here, still write my technical documents, and still occasionally hike the approved trails. But I never venture deep into the forest anymore, and I've sold my paintball equipment. Some places in this world exist beyond our understanding, operating according to rules we can't comprehend. That night in the Appalachian forest taught me that sometimes the greatest danger isn't in what you can see, but in realizing that what you're seeing shouldn't be possible at all. The forest keeps its secrets, and after what we experienced, I'm content to let them remain hidden in the depths of those ancient woods. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind moves through the trees, I think about that figure in our camp, the one wearing what looked like Isaac's coat, and I wonder if it's still out there, searching for something in the darkness of the forest. The sun was setting over the pines as I shouldered my backpack, taking one last glance at the world of comfort and familiarity I was leaving behind. At 19, I thought I was ready for anything, confident in my ability to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did I know I was about to embark on a journey that would test the very limits of my courage and forever alter the course of my life. I had been looking forward to this week-long camping trip with my fellow venture scouts for months. As the only female in our troop, I was accustomed to being the odd one out, but I never let that stop me from embracing adventure with open arms. However, when my friend and tent mate unexpectedly backed out just days before our departure, I found myself facing the prospect of venturing into the mountains alone, surrounded by strangers. But I was a venture scout, fearless, resourceful, and ready to prove myself in the wild. With a deep breath and a determined stride, I set off towards the unknown, blissfully unaware of the darkness that awaited me in those silent woods. The campsite was already buzzing with activity by the time I arrived, the air thick with the scent of pine and the excited chatter of my fellow scouts. As I surveyed the sea of unfamiliar faces, it quickly became apparent that I was not only the sole venture scout present, but also the only girl in a troop of teenage boys. For a moment, an icy tendril of apprehension slithered down my spine, but I quickly brushed it aside. I had dealt with my fair share of awkward situations before, and I wasn't about to let a little gender imbalance throw me off my game. Besides, most of the Boy Scouts seemed friendly enough, greeting me with warm smiles and welcoming me into their fold, as if I had always been one of their own. As I began to settle into the rhythm of camp life, pitching my tent and acquainting myself with my new companions, I couldn't help but notice one scout who seemed to stand apart from the rest. His name was Danny, and from the moment our eyes first met across the campfire, I felt an inexplicable unease wash over me. There was something about the way he looked at me, his gaze lingering just a little too long, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that bordered on obsession. At first I tried to shrug it off as mere social awkwardness, convincing myself that he was simply uncomfortable around girls. But as the days wore on and his behavior grew increasingly erratic, I began to realize that there was something far more sinister lurking beneath his seemingly innocent exterior. On our second day at camp, the troop leaders announced that we would be embarking on a day-long hike through the surrounding wilderness. As we gathered our gear and prepared to set off, I found myself paired with none other than Danny himself. My heart sank as he sidled up beside me, his face splitting into a grin that was just a little too wide, his eyes sparkling with a manic energy that set my nerves on edge. But I was a venture scout, and I wasn't about to let some scrawny, wild-eyed boy intimidate me. I squared my shoulders and met his gaze head-on, determined to show him that I was not someone to be trifled with. As we set off down the trail, Danny's attempts at conversation quickly took a disturbing turn. He peppered me with invasive questions about my age, my home life, and my relationships, his voice dripping with a sickening sweetness that made my skin crawl. When I tried to deflect his inquiries with polite but firm responses, he only grew more persistent, his questions becoming increasingly explicit and inappropriate. I could feel the panic rising in my throat as he began to expound upon the intricacies of BDSM, his words painting vivid pictures of rope burns and bruises that made my stomach churn. I wanted nothing more than to turn and run, to put as much distance between myself and this twisted individual as possible. But I forced myself to maintain my composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. As the hike wore on and Danny's behavior escalated, I found myself growing more and more desperate for escape. His touch became bolder, his fingers grazing my skin with a possessiveness that made my blood run cold. I flinched away from his advances, my arms wrapped tightly around myself as if I could somehow shield my body from his predatory gaze. Just when I thought I could endure no more, salvation appeared in the form of two fellow scouts rounding the bend ahead. Seizing my chance, I quickened my pace and called out to them, pleading for their company on the remainder of the trek. Though they initially hesitated, citing the troops' pairing protocol, one look at my ashen face and trembling hands was enough to sway them. As we made our way back down the mountain, Danny's eyes boring holes into my back with every step, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. As night fell over the campsite and my fellow scouts retreated to their tents in pairs and trios, I found myself once again alone, isolated by virtue of my gender. The scoutmasters had insisted on placing my tent far from the boys, citing concerns for my privacy and safety. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, I couldn't help but feel more vulnerable than ever before. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying the events of the day in an endless loop of dread and paranoia. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of movement outside my tent sent my heart racing, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife my father had pressed into my palm before I left, his eyes heavy with unspoken fears. It was in the darkest hours of the night that I first heard it. The sound of my tent flap unzipping, the whisper of fabric against fabric as someone slipped inside. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I peered through the darkness, my eyes straining to make out the figure looming over me. And then I saw it, the glint of eyes in the moonlight, wide and unblinking as they stared down at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. It was Danny, his face twisted into a mask of manic obsession as he loomed over my prone form, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed in the stillness of the night. I lay there paralyzed, my heart pounding in my ears as I clutched my knife with white-knuckled fingers, every muscle in my body tensed for a fight. But Danny made no move to touch me, his gaze roving over my body with a sickening intensity as he muttered incoherently under his breath. "Are you there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hammering of my pulse. "I know you are. I can feel you." For what felt like an eternity, we remained locked in that twisted tableau, predator and prey, trapped in a dance of fear and obsession. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Danny was gone, slipping back into the night like a phantom, leaving me shaken and sleepless in his wake. As the days wore on and the nighttime visitations continued, I could feel myself unraveling at the seams. Exhaustion clouded my mind, my reflexes dulled by the constant state of hypervigilance that had become my new normal. I clung to the other scouts like a lifeline, seeking safety in numbers, even as I struggled to maintain the facade of the unflappable venture scout I had once been. But Danny's obsession only seemed to grow with each passing day, his advances becoming bolder and more brazen with every encounter. He would appear behind me without warning, his fingers grazing the nape of my neck with a possessiveness that made my skin crawl. He would lean in close, inhaling the scent of my hair with a hunger that bordered on the feral. And still, I said nothing, convinced that to show weakness was to invite destruction. I had grown up in a world where self-reliance was the only currency that mattered, where asking for help was tantamount to admitting defeat. And so I suffered in silence, my mind and body slowly eroding under the weight of Danny's twisted attentions. It wasn't until the scoutmasters pulled Danny aside one day, their faces grim with unspoken concern, that I began to feel the first flickers of hope. I watched from a distance as they spoke to him in hushed tones, their words inaudible but their meaning clear. And then, just like that, Danny was gone, sent home in disgrace for reasons I could only imagine. In the days that followed, I tried my best to put the horrors of that week behind me, to lose myself in the simple joys of camp life and the camaraderie of my fellow scouts. But even as I laughed and sang around the campfire, even as I marveled at the beauty of the wilderness around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had fundamentally changed. It's been years since that fateful camping trip, but the memories of those dark days still linger in the shadows of my mind. I often find myself wondering what became of Danny, if he ever found the help he so clearly needed, or if he simply disappeared into the world, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But more than that, I find myself reflecting on the lessons I learned in those silent woods, the truths about myself and the world around me that were forged in the crucible of fear and survival. I learned that there is a darkness in this world that cannot be explained or understood, a twisted sickness that lurks in the hearts of men and women alike. I learned that even the most seemingly innocent of faces can mask a monster waiting to be unleashed. But I also learned that I am stronger than I ever could have imagined, that within me lies a wellspring of courage and resilience that cannot be extinguished by even the darkest of nights. I learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to stand your ground and fight, to refuse to be cowed by the shadows that threaten to consume you. And so I carry those lessons with me, a talisman against the darkness that will always be a part of me. I am a survivor, a warrior forged in the flames of adversity, and no matter what horrors the future may hold, I know that I will always have the strength to face them head-on, my father's hunting knife clutched tightly in my hand, ready to cut through whatever demons may come my way.